Section 37 bonusing and inclusionary zoning. At the moment, there's a lot of work that's being done in Hamilton. Currently, we are updating the downtown secondary plan. Along with that, we're doing a tall building study, and as well, we're doing a density and height testing for the downtown. In addition, recently the province made some announcements on inclusionary zoning, and of course, in downtown, we have some future planned investments with LRT, so we think it's a really exciting time to bring together some other pieces that may build on what's happening in Hamilton, and that's the piece on Section 37 density bonusing and inclusionary zoning. So today, we hope that this session is educational for staff and for yourselves, and we're going to begin with 4 presentations. We've had a lot of work that's been put together to make this happen, and the first presentation that we will be hearing is from Shonda Wang. Shonda's a senior planner and urban designer with the consulting firm SVN, and she's been working closely with us on the development of our tall building guidelines for downtown. And Shonda's going to provide us with an overview of municipal bonusing in Ontario. After Shonda, we have the pleasure of having John McKenzie, the Deputy City Manager, Planning and Growth Management at the City of Vaughan, who will be taking time out of his busy schedule to come here to speak to us about bonusing at the City of Vaughan and their experience with it. Some of you may be familiar with John. He used to work with the ORC, and he's been doing a lot of work in Hamilton and probably has been before council many times in the past. He may have to scooch out a little bit early, we're not sure yet, but he wanted to be in Toronto for the announcement this afternoon. After John, we'll have Joanna Weiss. She's one of our solicitors with the city who will be talking about the legal considerations related to bonusing. And then finally, after Joanna, I'm sure the exciting part that everybody's been waiting for is the presentation on inclusionary zoning from Ed John, who is our senior project manager for housing and West Harbour. He's the housing and West Harbour planner. So I'd like to invite Shonda Wang to come down to start off with our first presentation.
Thank you, Alyssa. And as Shonda is coming down to the podium, I was remiss to acknowledge our former colleague, Mr. Brad Clark, is in the audience with us today, the former MPP of Stoney Creek East. Welcome.
I don't think, yeah, it's pretty, okay. And then this is
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for including me in your conversation and beginning discussions today on Section 37 and bonusing, and I'm really interested to hear the other speakers today as well. The purpose of my presentation today is to provide a very brief and general overview of Section 37, including the regulatory context in which municipalities, let me just see if this slide. There we go. The regulatory context in which municipalities are able to negotiate for community benefits. Just a very brief overview of existing Section 37 policies in Hamilton today. A brief summary of the policy framework, approaches, and protocols used to negotiate Section 37 benefits in other GTHA municipalities, and an overview of some of the key issues and opportunities for consideration as Hamilton thinks about potentially implementing bonusing. So this slide has a lot of information, but I'll just try to talk through it with you today. But first of all, just starting with an overview of what Section 37 is and where it's actually contained. It's Section 37 of the Planning Act allows municipalities to grant additional height or density allowance to a developer beyond what's permitted in the zoning bylaw in return for provisions of facilities, services, or matters. Benefits received in exchange for increases in height or density must have a direct planning relationship to the proposed development, and for example, through the inclusion of a daycare facility, if in the vicinity of that development, that's deemed as something that's needed in the community. Overall, municipalities set their own bonusing policies and terms through local official plans. And at a minimum, these policies typically describe One, the types of benefits that can be secured through a Section 37 agreement, including cash or in the form of something in kind. The thresholds and conditions which must be satisfied to trigger the need for an agreement, and some kind of detail with regard to the timing of the execution of agreement and the payment of cash benefits. So typically at the time of the zoning bylaw amendment, you would execute the agreement, and upon issuance of the building permit, the developer would release funds. But really beyond these limitations, there's very different approaches to how municipalities might carry out Section 37. They might opt to set out more detailed policies through a secondary plan, or and/or create implementation guidelines to direct how Section 37 would be negotiated. Here in Hamilton, as you're probably well aware, Hamilton's official plan currently provides a policy framework for negotiating Section 37 agreements, although there are no further implementation mechanisms currently in effect. So this is how that process might unfold. There's no guidance there currently. The list of identified community benefits that are eligible for Section 37 agreement is fairly extensive and includes childcare facilities, arts and cultural facilities, public art, recreational facilities, and preservation of natural heritage features, amongst many others. Unlike other municipalities that we'll be taking just a kind of an overview of in the next several slides, Hamilton's OP does not specify a minimum threshold for triggering the need for Section 37 agreements. So the next few slides go into some examples of how various municipalities in the GTHA carry out Section 37, starting with Toronto. And if you just follow along with the graphic at the bottom of the screen, Section 37 agreements in Toronto typically comprise of three elements. One, the community benefit contributions, which may include cash contributions or a dedication of gross floor area to particular use. Back to that daycare as an example. Just for note, in Toronto, I understand that approximately 55% of benefits secured are in kind, and about 45% are cash in lieu. In addition to this, there would be the public art contribution as part of the city's 1% for public art campaign, and three, what's termed matters of legal convenience, which really may include any items that are secured as part of the rezoning, but don't specifically belong in a zoning bylaw amendment. So, for example, a dedication or a conveyance of additional lands. General policies for implementing Section 37 agreements are set out in the official plan. For example, the OP sets out a minimum threshold for developments which are required to enter into a Section 37 agreement. And the official plan does explicitly recognize additional density policies set out in secondary plans. For example, in North York Centre, there is a secondary plan that specifies the particular incentives that are provided for the provision of certain community benefits. In fact, they have a detailed benefits agreement or matrix that defines this. Additionally, the city has a set of implementation guidelines that provide direction on how Section 37 agreements are negotiated, and it's important to note that the city is currently undertaking an update to this protocol to provide more transparent, a transparent process for negotiations. In Mississauga, the city has set out broad policies for Section 37 agreements in its OP, with additional detail provided in a staff report that provides direction on process and protocol. And this staff report also describes the minimum thresholds where Section 37 may apply, and also how they're negotiated. Important to note that through the negotiations process, the city will retain an independent appraiser to evaluate the uplift created as a result of the additional height and density, and has sought up to 40% of the uplift value and benefits. Burlington has a similar structure to Toronto and Mississauga in that the broad policy framework is set out in the OP with additional detail provided in an implementation protocol, although differs in that Burlington has established a value quantum like Vaughan, and I know we'll be hearing from John McKenzie on this in a moment. They also do have a separate negotiator who is actually essentially city staff from planning to negotiate on behalf of the municipality. During a review of the protocol several years ago in 2012, Burlington did implement some key changes that provided greater opportunity for public input, and specifically the city now requires a statutory public meeting to be held prior to an application going to Community Development Committee. This public meeting provides information on how possible Section 37 benefits information on possible Section 37 benefits so that stakeholders and elected officials have the time to weigh benefits against impacts in advance of receiving a recommendation report from staff and essentially rendering a decision on the application. Now, this is all interesting in the context of the fact that public consultation is not mandatory under the Planning Act, but we're seeing how it is really important as part of this process. So based on the policies and protocols that we've just kind of reviewed and just started to review really, we've identified a number of common issues and opportunities that the City of Hamilton might consider as it's thinking about the potential implementation of Section 37 here in this city. I have a couple slides on this. One is to first of all define applicable benefits in the statutory OP policies, and as I did say, the city does currently have an extensive list of potential benefits. However, it would be good to think about, are there any additional benefits that could be added or specified? For example, right now the OP talks about providing a cultural facility as one example of a benefit, but do we want to detail that more to say, for example, artist and or live-work facility? Additionally, the city should consider how to appropriately identify benefits that are subject to Section 37. Should this be based on a citywide or a downtown-wide community services and facilities study, and how could we coordinate this together with the implementation of Section 37? 2, drafting a protocols and guidelines document to provide a more transparent and consistent methodology in securing Section 37 benefits. It would be beneficial to have a clear protocol document approved by council, similar to the guidelines prepared by the City of Toronto or the City of Vaughan. And really the need to identify a process or protocol that meets Hamilton's particular needs. Additionally, is there a need to establish a minimum threshold for development subject to a Section 37 agreement? Point 3, determining the need for more precise secondary plan policies, which is really particularly important if you want to implement planning goals, following the example, for example, of North York Center secondary plan. Point 4, establishing a level playing field for valuation. This is important for the city in order to establish a measurable, transparent, and consistent process for negotiating Section 37 funds and benefits. And as we were just discussing for Mississauga, and we'll hear for how Vaughan has achieved this, this could be done through the independent appraisals of value uplift. Point 5, accounting for discrepancies between official plan and any legacy zoning. So what is the appropriate base from which you could calculate uplift? Point 6, the timing and scope of public consultation. So should the public be consulted prior to the execution of a zoning bylaw implementing a Section 37 agreement to provide input on negotiated benefits, like the City of Burlington? In Toronto, some councillors position it like, we will likely be having some Section 37s coming. What would you like to see? And this might be in addition to a community services and facilities study that would outline what the need is. But in any case, there is a need for strong integration of community needs and built form development, and a healthy discussion of the appropriate use of Section 37 funds. The role of the ward councillor in the negotiations, should this be occurring on a site-by-site basis, or should councillors be involved with the bigger picture of what the ward needs? So, for example, should councillors be more involved during the preparation of a community services and facilities study? And that forthcoming Section 37 reporting requirements, the bill is passed, but regulations are not yet implemented. So just in closing, Section 37 funds, it's important to note that they do predominantly apply to the areas of the city experiencing rapid growth. And we can see how this is a valuable tool and very important at a time when governments typically have less resources to pay for these elements. But important to note also that Section 37 cannot address the totality of public benefit needs. It is one tool to provide and fund community services and facilities, but that would be at a local community level. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Shonda. Are there any questions for the presenter, please? Councillor Farr.
Sorry, I was just, before we take questions, I was told earlier that we might be holding questions until after John McKenzie's presentation. Is that correct?
With all due respect, we'll just ask the committee here. Would you like to ask questions after the end of each presentation, or would you like to ask it at the end of it all? Clarification questions? Sure, go ahead.
Just for clarification.
Yes.
You said the bill is cast, but implementation is not in your closing comment. Can you expand on that? I'm not sure exactly what you said, but something to that effect as you wrapped up there, Shonda.
Yes. It's just worth noting that the recently passed amendments to the Planning Act under Bill 73 requires that municipalities account annually for all cash received through Section 37, but this does not come into force until more detailed regulations are approved.
That's the province's job.
Yes, it's part of that process.
Chair, on slide 4, you had potential benefits, and you include a few examples: childcare, cultural art facilities, public art rec facilities, preservation of natural heritage features, etc., but you don't have affordable housing in the mix. That could be included in the mix.
Yes, essentially I was actually just drawing from what are existing policies in the official plan, so benefits that are currently outlined, and this is just an example of some of those elements that are captured there.
Thank you. And Councillor Vanderbeek has a question for clarification as well.
Thank you. Through the chair, I'd just like to pursue that. My understanding is that the list of benefits that you have up there have to be applied within the area of, for instance, within the ward, but that affordable housing can be citywide. So can you just make a note of that and perhaps talk to that for a minute?
Sure. In the context of, if it's a benefit secured through a Section 37 agreement, the Planning Act states that the benefits would have to be, there would have to be a planning connection or a nexus to where that development is planned for and where the community benefits would be. You would have to be able to show some connection to more that local community where that development would be. It's not to say that there wouldn't be affordable housing policies that could be applied citywide, but just not through, well, it could be through Section 37 benefits as long as you could tie it to a relationship to the development that's being proposed.
Councillor?
Thank you. That's not my understanding, so I'm going to be asking that question again to other presenters. So I just want to put that forward so that they know that I'm going to be addressing that, because my understanding is clearly that affordable housing, Section 37 can be applied to affordable housing anywhere in the city. So I just want to put that on the table so that that's out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Councillor Partridge, clarification?
Yes, thank you. Just very quickly, Shonda, thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it. But I think the majority of the folks here are here to find out and to hear about how does affordable housing fit into the Section 37, how, our OP, and how can we take advantage of that. And I'm a little bit disappointed that there's nothing in the presentation about the affordable housing connection, because I think that's clearly what, certainly from my perspective, with all the development going on in Waterdown, that's something that I'm very focused on. Can we take a percentage of any of those developments? And maybe you could just speak to that, just to clarify. Is there anything in Section 37 or a policy that we could implement that would allow for inclusionary zoning within any of the new developments that are coming through? Because certainly I'm in a high-growth area.
Right. It's my understanding, first of all, that there are, the speakers following myself will be really focused on exactly that, the topic of affordable housing tied to inclusionary zoning, for example. So I think I'll leave room for other speakers to address that.
Okay, thank you very much.
And thank you, Shonda. I know that there's some people that need to leave, so it's kind of nice to get their questions in when they can.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And now I would like to, may I have a motion, please, to receive Shonda's presentation? Councillor Collins, Councillor Pearson, all those in favor. Thank you, Shonda.
Thank you.
And now density bonuses, Section 37 implementation. The City of Vaughan experience presenter is John McKenzie, Deputy City Manager, Planning and Growth Management of City of Vaughan.
Thank you, and good morning, Madam Chair, members of Council, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. First of all, I do want to say thank you to Christine, Alyssa Mahood, and Jason, and Janice Atwood as well. Their tenacity in getting me here today is really remarkable. I saw them at I saw Christine at a presentation I was doing on Section 37 in Toronto at Ryerson, and she approached me and said, you know, this is exactly the kind of thing that our council is grappling with. It looks like Vaughan has been grappling with this for the last few years, and could you come and speak? And they just stayed on me. So luckily I'm here today, and thank you again for the opportunity. I'm so impressed. I was driving around today and seeing all these fantastic developments taking place in the city. It's just great, and you have such a professional team, and I just want to commend you on your team here at the city.
Thank you, John. Can you move the microphone up just
Sure.
a smidge?
Okay, just a smidge. Is that better? Thank you. Okay, so good morning. Why am I here today? And I think the real reason is that the City of Vaughan has been experiencing a wave of intensification. We are, like Hamilton, beneficiaries of major investment and interest on the transit, and our population growth is it's quite a curve. We're jumping from a population right now of 320,000. We'll be at 500 plus by 2041. That's the current estimate, and there's quite a bit of that is in intensification. So I'm briefly going to go through our recent experience creating an up-to-date Section 37 policy. I'm going to talk about how the guidelines were such a key part of this in order for council to be able to get broader stakeholder support for this, the implementation guidelines. I'm going to go through a few case studies. I will touch on some of the affordable housing concerns. We haven't been achieving as much affordable housing, but some of the nearby municipalities, there's been a couple of success stories, and I'll comment on some of that because that seems that's an area of interest, and I'll talk about some of the challenges and opportunities and where we're going next. So again, intensification in the city. Bus rapid transit, we've got 3 new subway stops in Vaughan, regional express rail through Metrolinx. We wanted to make sure that the development happening around all of this transit investment was done in a way that reflected the highest quality of urban design, reflected the community building processes that we went through the secondary plans. And related to Section 37, we have, as you probably have, this gap between what is a level of service that is based on historic levels of service and what is the planned level of service. And that's a real challenge in the municipal sector. So we wanted to try to make sure that we narrowed that gap, if possible, if we could use some of that Section 37 funding to narrow that gap. But we needed a clear and reproducible process for doing this. So the community knew what we were doing, and the development community was going to be on board. Really quickly, and with reference to this map, where you see the red and there's some pink, Purple, that's where we have bus rapid transit lines planned. You can see that Spadina subway extension coming north from Steeles going northward into our Vaughan Metropolitan Center, which will be a population of 30,000 in an area of 200 acres. Just a great deal of intensification with the Barrie-Go corridor line going north-south, which will eventually have 15-minute service, two-way all day. There's a great deal of density and intensification happening in these areas. New hospital, etc. So a great deal of investment, and we wanted to make sure that we had a framework for intensification to get some benefit to the community from all of this intensification happening around transit. So we have an official plan, we had an enabling official plan, not that different than the City of Hamilton one that you saw earlier. We had those enabling policies in the official plan, but I think what we wanted to do was to add some information as we embarked on updating our Section 37 policy. We wanted to add some additional information as to how it can be used and what made sense. We are aware of the Ontario Municipal Board hearing findings related to the nexus argument that the benefit has to be, generally the benefit has to be used in that area. So we wanted to do that, and so we outlined some of this in the official plan policy to try to get some more buy-in and support from everyone. So they knew what we were doing, it was transparent, and everyone eventually came on board. So we started down the road of these revised policies in 2013. We had a lot of questions about how are you going to value this. At the end of the day, people care about how this affects their pro forma. The community cares about what that, and councillors, well, what are we talking about? What is the quantum of this Section 37 benefit? So we retain an appraisal firm in order to, and one of the better ones, GSI, known for their involvement in a lot of these board processes. We retain them to help us develop a clear, reproducible methodology for obtaining a clear benefit, and something that if we needed to go to the OMB to defend, we could. So that was an important step to work on that methodology. We had so many meetings related to this. A lot of it was with the development community and the representatives. There we have the York chapter of Build, or Ontario Home Builders. Here you would have the HHBA, I guess, or there would be that same type of stakeholder discussion that went on for some time. We also had community interest groups that were concerned that Section 37 would, be a, call it a Trojan horse for vertical sprawl. Really, they were concerned that Section 37 was going to be levered as an opportunity to come into these lower density areas and increase the height and densities, and so there was a lot of discussion that had to take place over that. All of our official plan, our new official plan, which wasn't even that new, what was the conformity amendment to the growth plan, all of it had been subject to a massive OMB appeal, and I know you've had some big ones here in Hamilton as well. We had, I think we're at 160 appeals to the official plan in Vaughan. Eventually, and they're being worked on, and there's been a lot of it that's been mediated, but there's quite a bit of development interest. So the OMB eventually did approve that policy framework that we had established. We did quite a bit of meetings, committee of the whole meetings, where we invited stakeholders if they needed to present anything, and I think the working meetings with the industry helped get support on that. So we eventually got to the point where we had the implementation guidelines supported by council. We talked about a little bit of this before. This is the basis, the crux of the policy, that it has to be a reasonable planning relationship, and that's good planning. And I don't want to, this is a very important thing. Our staff, we will not, and we have a design review panel as well, but we will not be recommending Section 37 or talking about the use of it unless we think it is a good quality development. And so I think that's a very important point to make here. It still has to represent good planning in the public interest, and there still needs to be infrastructure present to support that. We're not going to be recommending increased height and density for a Section 37 benefit if those factors are not met at the outset. Some of this has been discussed before, but I think it's just, I want to talk a little bit about the question that Councillor raised about affordable housing here too. And we talked about the different benefits. We want to make sure that this point is very clear, that these benefits are over and above what could be secured through Planning Act or DC Act contributions. So the public art, the not-for-profit, the cultural facilities, if there are park improvements, it's something that's above a normal level of service. And I think that's very important. A lot of people lose sight of that, and we actually have some pretty testy discussions with this, with the development community or individual developers who fail to make that connection. But we want to make sure that it's over and above. And if it's for public transit, we got to make sure that the site is planned already to maintain those connections to transit. But if it's over and above, and I'll talk about some of those detailed benefits later. For affordable housing, and I just want to make a point about this, maybe it's a good point now, affordable housing is something that we try to seek. In our case, you're a single tier. We have an upper tier regional municipality, so they're the housing provider, so we have to work with them if we're trying to secure something like that. We are working on something like that right now with them, where they would then take on units in the building. Like, we quantify the benefit of that Section 37 increase within and so we get a dollar value of that, and then we somehow work with the housing provider to determine how that's going to work. Is it a number of units that, in our case, York Region Housing is going to take on? Is it a number of, and that's really the way it is. I mean, there are some challenges as to how you access into that, and there's some concerns from developers. Is that a stigma issue? Is there something else? Is there a way do they need separate access or anything like that? Those are types of challenges that have come up in the discussion, but I think right now we've been able to achieve some of that in York Region through working with the developer and working to secure units within the actual buildings in some of these high-rise buildings. We talked about this before. It's really that reasonable planning relationship. What we do, and I think what was mentioned, is the site-specific zoning bylaw amendment. How do we implement this? So we bring forward a bylaw that will identify specifically, and we indicate this in our committee of the whole report, as we move through the development approvals process, we will indicate in our report what the benefits are. That will then be translated into a bylaw with that amount identified clearly in the bylaw, which will then go into that specific reserve that's been set up through finance, and that will be tied to that agreement. And that agreement, all of that comes together towards the latter part of the planning process when we go to committee. So just going back to this official plan policy and the whole process, having that implementation guideline framework was really key. I'm just going to talk about that implementation guideline because I think this is an important part of how council can be involved in this as well. So importantly, we want to make sure that council is insulated in some degree, or councillors, individual ward councillors are insulated in some degree from the criticism that has been either fairly or unfairly targeted toward councillors in the City of Toronto and I think people have read the articles, and there's been articles about how, it's a let's make a deal in this ward approach that certain councillor will take, and you're not going to get your project through unless you make a deal with that councillor. So our Mayor Mauricio Bevilacqua, and members of council were very concerned about getting negative criticism on this. So one of the things that we worked out with committee, council, stakeholders was that planning staff, staff from a real estate group as well, would work on the negotiations, would manage a lot of these negotiations, taking into account that appraisal methodology and the guidelines we had set up. We would we would of course consult all the local studies that had been prepared in advance, so those secondary plans or those neighborhood studies that had taken place. In some cases, they'd be streetscape plans that involved a lot of community consultation, but we would consult those plans and those studies to look at what made sense. And this is a bit of an art. It's not a science, it's an art between the developer, between the community. It's a dance. It's a dance. Fair. It is a dance, and it's. I'm not a great dancer. Well, there's a couple things a couple dances. I went to those lessons, but the thing is, what's amazing is that it's you never know what it's going to be. At times, people have tried to, there's one particular developer, I'm not going to name him, but he's got this giant goose statue that he had commissioned, and he's always trying to put it in a project, and we don't want it. But anyway, it's great. It's a great statue of a Canada goose, but he's always trying to. It always comes up as his public art contribution, and we really don't want it. But anyway, you'll see it somewhere, some point with a certain developer. But anyway, someone's going to give in at some point. But we really, what we want to do is make sure those are community-derived benefits, that they make sense. And we have had public art. We have had public art adjacent or abutting a development, but it's something that we want to make sure is accessible. We want to make sure it's something that involves that input from the community. So one of the things that we're seeing is that the ward councillors on their own now, in order to ensure that the benefit makes sense for the community, some of them have taken it on their own. We've had one councillor that has had a couple of public meetings around it. I've got this proposal in here. It's a massive project, and I'll show you a picture of it in a second. Do you want? What are you thinking of? What would be the most proper use of the Section 37 benefit? And that way, they feel that they haven't gone out on their own. They're not out on a limb, and they're protected in that way. One of the things that we've done to try to be as transparent as possible and to take away that criticism that it's a behind the scenes, let's make a deal type of meeting is to ensure that that benefit is put into the committee of the whole report. So not the earlier one. In the public hearing report, the statutory report that goes forward, we identify that Section 37 may be opportune to look at Section 37 in this location, and that gives a signal for the public, and that way we'll find out if any stakeholders, residents, community groups show up. They can flag that and say, we don't want to see Section 37 here. We want to keep it low. But what we found is that most of the time, it really depends on what it is, and stakeholders are becoming more sophisticated on this, and if it's the right type of benefit, and if it's modest increase in density, and it's not going to create a negative impact, we're getting some support on that. So the negotiation process, we don't put all of this out there because it is a negotiation process. We go to closed session. We have a closed report that talks about some of this sometimes if it's a really contentious thing, but we include in our final recommendation report to committee, we include, here's what we've arrived at, here's what the benefit is, and so it's crystal clear. And so that's another opportunity. So if members of the committee, members of the public want to come to committee and share their concerns with the approach, or they don't like whatever piece of public art that's proposed, or they don't want to see that contribution to the playhouse or whatever is proposed, they can share that with committee. Going back, it's got to be good planning or we won't support it. We want to make sure that we always take into account all the policies that are in effect for an area. And let's see, here's a really quick overview of what this is. We go for the base density. First, we try to see what is in our official plan as permitted by our Vaughan official plan. In your case, if there's a secondary plan or if there's an area study in the official plan that shows that density, we'll look at that. What we found is our zoning bylaws were so out of date, they were not reflecting reality. Unless there were certain situations where we had a more up-to-date zoning bylaw, say if it was in the last 10 years and there was a site-specific project that got an earlier entitlement through a public process, we would reference the zoning bylaw as well. But most of the time we went through the official plan as our way of finding the base density. We determined the buildable GFA from that base density, and we go through a land value matrix, which the appraisers help us identify, which shows the per square foot values in that area based on recent trades in land, and then we find a value that corresponds to the proposed density. And then what we do, we just simply subtract that, the proposed increase in value. And then this is an interesting part, and this was a big part of the stakeholder buy-in on this. We had a great debate with the building industry about what is the percentage to apply. We ended up, and council ended up, staff were somewhere 25 to 40%, I think, originally. We ended up at 20 to 35% to obtain industry buy-in and support for the project. And where we apply 20 and where we apply 35 is another dance, if you want to characterize it as a dance. That's another dance that happens. And when we apply 20%, it's more for those areas where there already are existing services, where there already are amenities. Where we apply the 35%, or closer to the 35%, is when there's quite a gap, and we're trying to achieve that, make up some of the gap between the level of service, the existing level of service, and what we've got planned for the intensification there. What we do with our land value matrix to make sure that it stays up to date is that we're updating it annually, and we included that in our in our reports to council. We said this is something we're going to have to update through our real estate department every that stays current through the end. We use TREB in our case because we're there. So when is it paid? And I think this is a key part of this as well, that the Section 37 contribution is due before the first above grade building permit. We do ensure that it's indexed as well. We talked about the concerns from stakeholders. The first one, mostly from the development community, was that it's just too high. We can't deal with a 20 to 35%. Well, we showed the research. We showed what other jurisdictions were doing. We showed that it worked, and so we've applied that. It's still very challenging. Most of the time we end up a little bit closer to the 20% than the 35%, but it's an ongoing dance discussion. The land value matrix, we are criticized that it's not flexible enough to take into account site-specific qualities. Well, that's fine. We dealt with that by creating a process, an escalation process and a resolution process, and I'll explain some of that. And there was a concern about agreeing on the base land value. It's going to cause a big delay. Well, we had to deal with those concerns, very legitimate concerns, and we had to deal with them. So how did we deal with them? If the value that we had, that base value, was contested, we set up a process for site-specific appraisals where we could request one, and if not, if we couldn't come to an agreement, we would commission a second appraisal report. And then we have, if that second appraisal report is within 15% of the first one, then the midpoint would apply. And then eventually at the outcome, again, this was a process of escalation to allow the discussion to continue. And if there's further disagreement on all this, then at the end of the day, there could be a peer review. If that doesn't work, eventually the project can go to the ONB. So, you know what, we don't want to go there. I don't think most developers want to go there nowadays. It's, I don't know how it is here for getting hearings, but I'm sure it's, there's a 9 to 12 month wait if you can even get that for pre-hearings and then get to hearings. There's it's a process getting to the board. The site-specific bylaw, we make sure that it's itemized very clearly. We make sure that agreement is put together and that the owner enters into that Section 37 agreement with the city prior to it going for final council approval. the agreement's registered on title, and that the contributions are paid prior to release of that first building permit. So our finance department will not give clearance until and so we have given clearance for some site servicing, for some like that. We don't give any approval prior to the release of the building permit. And as was indicated, we were already there. The province has now required it through Bill 73 amendments, but you have to have that dedicated fund. So here are some of the projects. We've had this is a BAFE Developments project where we had, if you know where the Promenade Mall is, Centre Street and Bathurst in the city of Vaughan, and the Section 37 contribution ended up being a public art installation that backs on and it goes up against a park and it's accessible to the community. There's community services that were a fund for community services. We have a nearby playhouse and we have some community space in there that needed to be upgraded. Was over and above our level of service. And then as well, because we have bus rapid transit in the area, we wanted to make sure that everyone was, sometimes we are able to negotiate development process, but this was something that the developer was agreeable to, and there was quite a bit of installation of hardware on the transit front too as well. There's, you can see when the buses are coming, and they've got it. They've got signage and they've got monitors and everything in the ground floor of the condo here. So the big issues, that's one of them. Again, which one should apply? For appraisal, but what do you do when it's about a question of height? That's another thing that we've had to tackle in the city. When do we provide that detail to the public? So sometimes it's never enough, but we're trying to be as transparent as possible. I mentioned about how the discussion of the ward councillor, but there's also the ratepayers involved, the developer involved in terms of determining the community benefits. And I think we've talked about the process for Metropolitan Center. We had one of those issues with height that came up, and we ended up having to value that what would be the premium that someone would put on as it went up, and we used that as a basis for trying to extract some additional value. In this case, previous council had allowed for unlimited height in the area and density. So it was a bit challenging. In our new official plan, we had a height cap, which was really something that the airports nearby wanted, because there's a flight approach. Really, that's what happened. The airports wanted a height cap, and so we actually, in our updated official plan, brought the heights down. Previous council had put an unlimited height limit there, and so whatever we used our new official plan height limit, and then the extra stories on top of this, we tried to value what the premiums they would charge on that. We've ended up, on some of these heritage areas, and this is something that I see when I drive around Hamilton, places like Dundas where there's a great deal of energy investment. We have areas, we have a place called Woodbridge in Vaughan, which is in the historic part of Woodbridge. We're getting some development proposals. It really does remind me a little bit of the main street of Dundas and what's going on. Your main street's it's better, it's more vibrant, and it is more vibrant. There's more stores, but in this case, there's proposals that are coming in that are kind of of a similar scale to what you're getting in terms of proposals. We had streetscape guidelines put in place and a secondary plan that was approved that established some guidance around height. We have a heritage conservation district in the area. So on this file that came in, we were able to work to include streetscape improvements, privately owned, publicly accessible open space, and we had the renovation and relocation of 2 heritage buildings. And so the cost of some of that upgrading, that was part of the benefit. So what we ended up getting out of this was that publicly accessible open space. That was something the community wanted. That was the benefit that came out of it in terms of the relocation of the houses. However, on this one, we actually had an interesting thing that happened. The community changed. And I know this happens in the planning process. A certain element of the community was on board with us going ahead at the official plan stage, and we actually were smart enough to secure the benefit with the change in the official plan. What happened was that there were some adjustments and changes to that project that some members of the community didn't like, or they came on at a later stage of the process, and so they've actually, they're up in arms now, and that particular person leading the charge is running for council, I think, next term. And so there's a whole movement now at the site plan and zoning process. The project resulted, there was hundreds of people that showed up at the community meeting for the site plan and zoning process, but the official plan had already gone through the process. So I think it spoke to me, there's a valuable lesson there. You should try to secure these Section 37 benefits at the earliest possible opportunity, get it locked down, and ensure that it's locked down and you get that agreement. And in this case, because it was subject to a Vaughan official plan appeal, we were able to get it secured at the official plan stage. And because you never know what's going to happen. You never know what's going to happen with the community. You don't know if the site's going to be sold to someone else, and they're going to come in with a slightly adjusted proposal, something new and different that's not going to match with the community. And so it was a valuable lesson learned. So at least at a minimum, we have an agreement for some of this. And even if things change dramatically, I think, at the OMB, if it's contested, it'll I hope, stand up. So how will we move forward? Again, this is a relatively recent thing in the city of Vaughan. It's dealing with this wave of intensification. But what we'll do to maintain, continue, and to continuously improve is that we will continuously report to committee on this, and we have committed to do a report. It's coming up at the end of this year. We'll start and finish by the first quarter of 2017, and we'll discuss all these challenges. But we're open for suggestions for improvement, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our lessons learned with you here today. So thank you very much, and I'm pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, John, and I do have a speaker's list for clarification. Councillor Collins first, Councillor Farr, and then myself.
Thanks, Madam Chairman, and through you to John. John, great presentation. How often is Section 37 used in terms of percentage of projects that might come forward in a calendar year? Is it a rare occurrence? Is it something that's in 10 or 15% of the applications? Do you have a ballpark figure?
Okay, so we probably have about 220 development applications, OP rezoning type applications that would come through the city in a year. We're in these intensification areas, we're probably only around 10 to 15 of those would be of a scale, of a size that would prompt a Section 37.
To determine whether or not you uphold the principles of your zoning bylaws or your density caps that you may have in place, or deviate from them for this, whatever that prize is. How is that handled from a bureaucratic standpoint? Politically, but
thank you very much for the question. It's an excellent question. I think one of the things that we as staff look at very carefully in those types of situations is the context. For example, in a more historic village setting in the city of Vaughan, in the Kleinberg area, if many of you have been there, there's the McMichael Gallery, and there's, I guess, that historic village type feel. We do have significant intensification planned by the development community. With the city, we actually didn't identify it as an intensification area. I think we identified an extra 350 people. It's not an area where we want to see intensification in that area as staff, and our official plan speaks to that. So I think a big part of it is that official plan process. So if your official plan has led you to, and that's been a community driven process, and all those supporting studies has led you to the point where you don't want to see that intensification, that speaks volumes to staff. Having said that, in some cases, if it is a very minor type of thing and that, ratepayers group is on board with it and they go to the councillor, the ward councillor, and they communicate at the committee, means that they're okay with some modest intensification in exchange for a Section 37 benefit. And in that case, there is an Islington streetscape plan that isn't funded and that the BIA wants to have done, but it's over and above level surface. There might be an opportunity to utilize it. I haven't seen that yet. I've seen more community interest against intensification that's been communicated to committee, to council, and as a result, we have not done Section 37 agreements in Kleinburg. In other parts of the city, for example, and most people are familiar with this, it's one of the only places my wife will come with me. There's a subway that's opening up in a year from now, just down the street, with rapid bus transit on Jane Street planned, and there's access to all the highways, et cetera, et cetera. There's no real impact from a height planning perspective that we can't mitigate. There are some issues related to community services and the lack of nearby community services that we're trying to address through Section 37. So because we have to address that need for community space or indoor community space, for example, soccer is a big deal in Vaughan. People want some indoor play areas or they want some inside community space. That's an opportunity that if we can get some of that built into a podium or into a city facility next to that project, that's an opportunity to look at the use of Section 37 for some increase in height and density, because there won't be a big impact on the community. So we do have to set that GFA through a secondary plan. In this case, we set most of that at 3 times and max height of 22 stories, but we do have projects that have come in at 30 plus stories and with a higher GFA, and so that's an opportunity if council is of a mind to do so, to look at Section 37. So it really is in large part based on context, based on the community interest. We've had, big public hearings, and there's only been 1 or 2 deputants come forward when they're talking about 16 buildings in that very location opposing the height and density. And so there isn't that much of a big community reaction. And so when council's looking at this, and then they'll go out to Kleinburg and there'll be 100 people that'll show up for a meeting and there'll be 20 people making deputations, council will be aware of, and the staff are watching quite closely as to what that reaction is, and we take that into account as to whether or not Section 37 is a possibility or not.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thanks. My last question, John, is related to, I've read with interest the experiences of GTA municipalities with Section 37. And I know that Mayor Tory's been critical of that process in terms of characterizing it as a situation of the haves and the have-nots. And so in areas where there's density and applications for higher densities, we see the community improvements, and you've listed some here today, but in other neighborhoods where those densities just don't make sense and those applications aren't in front of the municipality, those communities aren't seeing those indoor soccer areas, playgrounds, transit improvements. How has Vaughan dealt with that situation, or are you still early in the game with that whole issue of certain neighborhoods will benefit from this because it's geographically specific, while others who are not in those areas of economic uplift and higher densities seem to be shut out of that process? Through you,
John?
Yes, through the chair, I think one of the things is that it is in large part what we're seeing, the market is in many ways reacting to the investments in transit and the availability of greyfield sites that they can redevelop. So it's largely market driven. So it's one of those things that, and I think Ken Greenberg in his book talked about it as urban judo. You really just have to take that energy and direct it in a way that makes sense. And in some cases, in some of those areas, there just isn't that opportunity, and the market isn't there. But what we are seeing, surprisingly sometimes, is that the market is looking at sites where we didn't have intensification planned. The market's looking at that for maybe a seniors housing project, a market housing project, or something like that. And in those cases, it might be an opportunity to apply some sort of Section 37 benefit in an area that we hadn't planned. if the impacts or if it's good planning and there are some services available. So it's one of those things that we're still working through. I think that's fair. We're working through this. It's early days, and it's something that we have to watch closely, the market, and then be in a position to respond. And so we're still learning.
Councillor?
Thanks for that. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Councillor Farr, clarification? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Is it only clarification
No, you
question?
may ask your question.
Thank you. Through you to John.
Clarification.
Your new OP, hopefully you can clarify, through the chair, says that the urban boundary expansion is only 3% in the coming years?
We're going to find out more about that at 2 o'clock today, or 1 o'clock, when the ministers make their announcement on the updated plans. We are, like you, creatures of the province, and I think much of what we will expand or not expand is dependent upon the density targets that we get when we do our sensitivity analysis, and depending on the targets for intensification that we will get from the province. And I'm assuming we're going to get that today at this afternoon when the ministers make their announcement about the outcome of the consolidated plan reviews, the land use plan reviews. That'll determine that. So right now we tell you it's even though we have a number of blocks planned for urban expansion already, we had a regional official plan amendment that was approved because we have a two-tier system, and there's been some concerns from the region about financing new infrastructure without development coming on board quickly. What we've seen is the region, our upper tier, saying that we want to make sure that there's a cost sharing to get the services there, or some of that is cost shared. And so what we've actually seen is a bit of a time delay. So we haven't expanded out. So that in itself is actually increasing the pressure for intensification and making projects like this and these types of community issues are coming to the fore because there's a great deal more emphasis on intensification projects.
That's where I was going. I mean, your OP through you, Chair, is going to be focused on what I'm reading, 45% of new development is intensification. Right. There's the starting point, I would assume, for your engagement and your consultation. It's kind of happening anyway.
Correct. Through the chair, it's correct. Our intensification is going to happen. I just think it's a question of it may go to 50, it may go higher. Based on what I'm hearing from the province, it looks like it may go higher, and so that's where we're going to be in this discussion. And intensification, it's going to continue on. It's going to become even more of an issue.
Councillor?
We hear a lot of ads about the city above Toronto, the city of Vaughan. I was fascinated in advance of the meeting here today to realize that you're not as big as I thought, but you're certainly getting big fast with 68% of your growth between 2006 and 2031, and getting upwards to about 450K. So how does that play a role, this massive and very quick growth in this discussion, this Section 37 discussion? Aside from
John?
Yes, through the chair, it's one of those things where what we're seeing now in the city is that on pretty much every corner where there's an opportunity, and we're seeing a lot of, I'd say a lot of grayfield strip plaza, commercial plazas being redeveloped, where some of the longer term, and some of these are the commercial REITs even, like a RioCan or someone like that has a long-term interest in the land. We're seeing, or Smart REIT, Smart Centers, that group of companies, they will be, they had an asset. It has produced a great deal of value for them from a one-story commercial type project. So what we're seeing is a lot of these gray fields being the focus of redevelopment, particularly on transit corridors. So I think that's what's prompting us to look at the opportunity. And in some of these areas, it has been largely a commercial area, but now there's transit, and so that's why the Section 37 discussion and some of the other tools that you're seeing that will be discussed today, it's becoming such an important part of city building. We really have to take into account the level of service or lack of services and see if we can make up the difference. We have been traditionally a greenfield community, and the level of service, the historic levels of service have really been to cater to that greenfield community. And now all of a sudden, you see these beautiful images of enhanced streetscapes and people having coffee and, sitting on a beautiful park bench and nice trees with the Silva-Sacs feeding them. It's all of these things that, they are a long-term operating costs for our various public works departments, and all these things have to be taken into account. So the Section 37, it's just a part of the effort to try to make up that difference.
Thank you, Councillor.
I'm glad you mentioned transit. You opened by saying essentially, quote, you are the beneficiaries on major investments in transit, end quote. And so I guess the higher order of transit along whatever corridor, the higher the heights, the densities, and that's part of this mix as well.
Yes, through the chair. Yes, through the chair. That's been a big part of this. And we have had those secondary plan processes. Ironically, we've had areas where, and I'm sure this may have happened in Hamilton, where people did not want to see higher heights and densities along the transit corridors. This happened in Vaughan, where we had people that actually didn't want the transit in their neighborhood. But it's a reality that it was coming anyway, and so we at the planning and growth group, we tried to find a way to find a balance in those areas. And so maybe the height was only 1.5 or the density was only 1.5 or 2 times whatever we could achieve on that corridor, recognizing the community concerns. And we had height limits of 4 stories, but we set up a framework, or 6 stories, sorry. We set up a framework where if they did certain things to exceed that, and those were clearly listed in those area studies, those Section 37 benefits were clearly listed. So that was the opportunity during those processes. We tried to coordinate with the transit agencies and do charrettes and explain this transit is coming to this area. We know it's going to prompt a market response. We know that people are going to come in with 8 or 10 or 12 or 15-story buildings. We'll set up an official plan framework for 6 stories, but we'll allow for 8 or something of that and some additional density if there's the following designs, principles adhered to, and if there's the following community benefits that are very clearly articulated that the developer is open to achieve.
Councillor?
Nice to hear that kind of confidence. They don't guess, they know that the transit's going to bring 8 or 10 or 12-story buildings. We like hearing that here in Hamilton. It's very reassuring, trust me. Through you, Chair, to John, you said something about the developer saying, as it relates now to affordable housing, just a few more questions and more specific to affordable housing. As part of our conversation here, we have tremendous challenges in Hamilton, and Vaughan, I'm sure, is no exception. I'm sure you're not of those rumors we've heard for years where to solve the issue of poverty, you give them a one-way bus ticket to this city. I hope not anyway. But
John, will you confirm?
Through you. No, don't do that. I don't want to get into that. You said some of the developers, as it related to affordable housing as a Section 37 incentive, found it to be a stigma issue. Can you expand on that? Like, what do you have specific examples where this was an issue?
Well, the specific example, through the chair to the council, the specific example was related to projects on Yonge Street in the municipality of Richmond Hill. We have a couple in progress, but they haven't quite landed. We're in the middle of mediation. I can't really speak to them, but there are ones in Richmond Hill that did land on Yonge Street where there was projects that part of the Section 37 benefit ended up being, in exchange for that height and density, multiple units that were then conveyed fee simple ownership to the housing provider. In this case, it was York Region as a housing provider, and so that was how it was conveyed, and it seems to have worked well. It helped. I mean, it's a modest achievement of Section 37. It's a modest way of getting some of that affordable housing stock. But it is, I mean, it's just, the key thing was having a frame of reference, trying to get quantum agreed on between the developer, between the people negotiating that benefit. And that's always the key thing, is trying to get in. And in most of these that I've been involved in, all these interior municipal board processes, it's, you know, we're always ending up, this battle to get a number. I think at most of the time you can talk about how the number will be applied. and what that use will be, but it still is a big battle to get that number. So, my advice in speaking to your council is that having some of that thought about getting a good appraisal methodology and working through some of those processes, so that way it's less of an onerous battle to get to that number is a big part of this policy development.
In your case, having that 20 to 35% in the matrix is helpful too, I'm sure, through you, Chair.
Through the chair, yes, it is helpful to have that range and having council support. I can't tell you how important it is as staff. When you walk into the room and know that you've got your council, when you've got your council behind you and that they have that policy and they've deliberately said they don't want to get involved in the process. We had some earlier challenges, some hiccups where we hadn't developed our Section 37 protocol and our guidelines to the point that we wanted to, and so there were some ad hoc development agreements that were made and Section 37 agreements that I won't call them knee-jerk, but they reflected a community interest, but they weren't properly supported by staff, by the methodology that I spoke of, the appraisal methodology, and I was a little concerned about that for council. It creates a bit of a risk that a member of council could be criticized. So I think the key thing is getting that figure, getting a way that you can ask staff to conduct the work that they need to conduct, and if they know that you have council support and they know that they have council support behind them, it helps a great deal as you go into those negotiating processes.
Thank you. Councillor?
Through you. So, just so I'm clear, I thought I heard you say there's about 10 to 15 developments currently ongoing in Vaughan, and of them 2 are quietly negotiating an affordable housing component?
Yes, we're working on trying to get more of that. I know our mayor is very keen on affordable housing. He wants that to be a bigger part of the discussion. There are some logistical challenges, though. I mean, it is a negotiation. So it is in some of these cases we're in mediation. We're trying to come to an outcome that works, and some people just didn't want to have affordable housing. But I think if you can find the right way to, and with the right developer, I think it's possible. I think it's just depending on the circumstances and the specific instances. And I think that strong council commitment on that, if that's an objective that council is really keen on pursuing, staff will make that front and center in the negotiation.
Thank you.
Sorry, so I'm clear, John, and I'm not trying to put you on the hot seat, but welcome to Hamilton.
Well, I've been here before in the hot seat. He's reminding me when I see Brad, I remember being on the hot seat. Yeah.
Well, Brad was here, no doubt there was a hot seat. Through you, Chair, you just said some people didn't want to have affordable housing. Are you referring to the developers or the community at large? Through
the Chair, it's been mostly the developer. They, in most cases, the developer wanted to achieve, a certain type of niche, or they were tailoring to a certain type of market, and they didn't want to introduce any affordable housing units in the project. We're working through that with a couple of the sites that we're involved in right now.
Yeah. So that sums up the stigma reference earlier.
That's right, and it's unwarranted. I mean, when you're talking affordability, I mean, these are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, it's I don't quite understand it, but it's something that we're still working through.
I'm glad you are, and it's great to hear your mayor is tackling it as well. We certainly have a mayor here that's all over the issue, as well as I would suggest all of us around this table and all of council. Finally, and this may be the craziest question of all, through you to John, I'm seeing a whole lot of the funds or the projects, the Section 37 projects, the bonusing, going towards projects that are capital in nature. And forgive me if I'm not fully aware of how it works. We will be soon, and we'll learn from your mistakes there in Vaughan. But can you not throw operating dollars at, existing and well thought of institutions in a city for Section 37?
Yeah, excellent question. Right now, we have not been doing that in our experience, and I have not seen. Now, I have seen, or I know of, certain things in the City of Toronto where there have been instances where there's been programs that certain councillors have negotiated, and We decided not to do that. We just thought it would be much clearer and transparent to see that it was, it's a capital project of this. What we wanted to ensure was, and what we try to do, say for example, it is a public art project adjacent to a condominium or something like that. We may try to negotiate a use agreement where there's some sort of obligation or there's a joint obligation for maintenance to help offset that publicly accessible private open space. Those POP situations that I showed you a picture of in that one in Woodbridge is one where the condominium corp, there'll be some, joint operational stewardship of that space, and that will offset and reduce the amount of operational funds expended, because that's a huge concern. We don't want to create these beautiful streetscapes that are then going to bankrupt us from an operating perspective. So more and more, I think this is another thing, this could be another focus of another session in the future, is how do you protect ourselves from being on the hook for a higher level of service? And I think it's accepting and making sure that there's an obligation in those open spaces for a private role in making sure that that level of service is maintained. If everyone's desirable of that beautiful looking open space or that pleasant streetscape, I think there's something to be said for having some joint management and stewardship of it from an operating perspective so that the city remains whole.
Thank you. Councillor Skelly.
Thank you. Through the chair, John, what is the current population of Vaughan?
We're at about 320,000.
And how many affordable housing units do you have?
Through the chair, I do not know. We are conducting studies of that. We have a secondary suite study that finished that identified, I think it was around 15,000, 20,000, but we actually don't have an exact number of how many affordable housing units I can give you right now. And if there is one, I haven't seen it yet.
Councillor?
Through the chair, you think it could be around 15?
Oh, no, I'm just talking about secondary suites, because that's fresh information where we've actually completed a study that identified secondary suites where people are being accommodated in and living in dwellings as a secondary suite, but we don't have an accurate number right now that I can reference. And I know there may be something there that, and hopefully with some more information coming out, we'll have that, but I don't have one on my, that I can give you.
Thank you. Through the chair, can you very briefly explain how the transit system works in Vaughan?
How our transit system works?
Bus Rapid Transit?
Yes, we have an operator. It's York Region Rapid Transit that is the primary operator, but we also have TTC buses that run up and down through the city of Vaughan that have arrangements with York Region Rapid Transit Company, which is the York Region operator. So York Region Rapid Transit has so we have a number of different services running through the municipality. Like you, we have Metrolinx, we have their buses, we have their trains that are running through our municipality, but we also have the TTC. We have, in some cases, Brampton Transit running through parts of our city because they're adjacent municipality, not unlike Burlington, I guess, coming into Hamilton. But we also, the interesting piece is the Toronto Transit Commission seeing a transit bus 20 kilometers up into the city of Vaughan, almost in King. They actually go all the way up to King Township in some cases and turn around and come back down on the lines. So there's operating agreements between them. The Bus Rapid Transit that I spoke of, that is a part, it's called Viva Rapid Co., and they're a rapid transit, it's part of York Region, and they're a corporation that was set up to work through the Bus Rapid Transit and the development of Bus Rapid Transit lines along, it would have been Highway 7, east-west and north-south. They run buses on Yonge Street and in other those major arterial corridors throughout the region.
Councillor?
Through the chair, and how is that being received? What is your ridership like on the Bus Rapid Transit?
I don't know the ridership. I can tell you that I'm sorry, I don't know what the ridership numbers are right now. But I think with all-day, two-day service, with it's bound to increase, and we're seeing the market respond to that as well. We're seeing quite a bit of development around the transit stations now.
Through the chair, I wanted to focus on that. Have you noticed a correlation between bus rapid transit and residential development, commercial?
Through the chair, yes, quite a bit of correlation. We're finding that pretty much every available space along those corridors that is ready for development, and we've seen, single-family homes, 3 of them strung together, assembled, and, an 8-story building will pop up, a 10-story building. People will start at 15, and eventually through a community process, we may end up at 8 or 10 or something like that. But along these bus rapid transit corridors, there's a huge amount of interest, and it's prompting a lot of redevelopment along those corridors.
Thank you. Councillor Vanderbeek.
Through you to John, thanks very much for the presentation. It's interesting to actually see what Vaughan has done in the process they've gone through. Can you tell me, I'm most interested at this point in the affordable housing, because you did touch on some other things that I had interest about, but I did declare I'm interested in the affordable housing, and I am. So when you use Section 37 for affordable housing in Vaughan, is it geared specifically to the inclusion of affordable housing within the building that's being built? Is it geared to something within the ward, or is it geared citywide?
So what we're doing, and I haven't landed these agreements yet, so I don't want to jinx them. Yeah, that's a good word. Yeah, I don't want to jinx the agreements. But what it is specifically, it's related to the developments in question. It's geared exactly towards the development. We're trying to monetize the increased height and density. In the case that I'm dealing with, we had a height and density established around 20 stories. The developer seeking 33, 34 stories, and a much higher GFA. They're looking at something like 5.5 times when we had 3 times and 3.5 times, I think it was, in the secondary plan for the area. So what we're trying to do is what that difference is that I spoke of, that quantum, within that range of that difference, we're trying to apply that to an affordable housing component of the building. So what we're trying to do is similar to what Richmond Hill did, is take that value from the increased height and density and apply it towards the affordable housing units. So that way the region would then take on ownership of those affordable housing units, and they would be something within a condominium corporation. The region would be an owner within that condominium corporation of units that they can then utilize for their purposes. And that's how we're doing it right now. There may be other ways to do it, but right now we've tried to work off what has been approved in Richmond Hill, our neighboring municipality to the east, and we're trying to lever that and to use that process for getting affordable housing units built into condos.
Councillor?
Thank you. And through the chair, are you getting a lot of resistance to that?
John?
Yes.
So, just on that same subject, through the chair to you, John, have you looked at what I understand Toronto is doing, which is basically saying that value that is over and above, that would be the 20 to 35% in Vaughan's case, can be applied citywide to the restoration of affordable housing units, to new affordable housing units, city housing type situations, which is something that we are very focused on at this point. So have you given any consideration to that, or have you not gotten that far?
We haven't gotten that far. It's been mostly focused on the specific development itself, but it's a good suggestion. I mean, it's something that we have a mayor and members of council that are very keen on achieving affordable housing in some way, and so it's something that perhaps we can have some more discussions on.
Councillor?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Pearson, if you don't mind taking the chair, please. I just have a few questions myself. John, thank you very much for coming. I know you need to get back for a great announcement, so I will be brief. In your presentation, and even the previous speaker's presentation, you talked about public consultation. You talked the value about it. In my experience, it's cost effective because you narrow down the project a lot quicker, especially when the community buys in. And then you talk about your lesson learned, that stakeholder support. So part of your stakeholders group, did it include public consultation, or was it specifically to developers and your staff?
Through the chair to the chair. What we did was public consultation was a big part of this. We had our Vaughan official plan, which was a larger official plan process that had public consultation. But I think what we really needed to do was to explain the value in developing our protocol and developing our guidelines. What we had to do was build in and make clear when the public had an opportunity to participate and to share their concerns about whether or not Section 37 and a Section 37 approach makes sense or not in a certain locale. I think we're still learning. Some members of the community at the very latest stage will come out and say, well, no, this shouldn't have been, you shouldn't be thinking about a higher height and density in this area for whatever reason they have. But what we would say is, well, we indicated in the public hearing report that this was coming. There has been typically, in some of those more sensitive environments, council may direct a community meeting, or the councillor will hold a community meeting to deal with what is of concern and what potential Section 37 benefits might be, and it comes up through that way. But you can never, I guess this is one of the things that we're having a challenge with this. How much can you convey? You're having a detailed real estate negotiation with a landowner, so how much can be public? And so I think what we've decided on in our experience is to put the conclusion of that in the final recommendation report. So we'll put the conclusion of that negotiation, where we can get to as staff and the developer, put that into that recommendation report, so when it goes to committee for consideration before council approval, there's that one last opportunity for the public to share their concerns and for council to make a decision based on what they hear at that meeting. So I think, as far as I can tell, it's the most transparent methodology in Ontario for now, because it's so recent, and I think we wanted to learn based on the work of others. It's the most transparent way of getting at that. We still have residents that will show up and voice concerns with that. It's not enough detail. We want to know what went on behind the scenes. We want to know how it changed throughout the negotiation process, but we feel we can't disclose that because of the nature of the discussions.
Okay, thank you. And through you to the chair, or to John, you're speaking more site-specific. And it's been our experience, and I'm sure all of my colleagues around the table will tell you that they've been to public meetings, public community information centers, where 300 people angry will show up, and then when you go down the pipe, after you've done your public consultation over and over again, you may end up with just 2 or 3 that are just not happy. So it's still a far cry from the 300 at the beginning. But I guess my question was, public consultation to actually devise the policy and the framework, solidify it, and make the language so specific so that it's there. By the time you get there, that is your map going forward. Is there a lot of public consultation to get to that framework for the city as a whole, or the ward as a whole, so that when applications, site-specific, come forward, then you have this policy to fall back on, and it's very specific policy?
Yes, there is, and I think it's because it's woven into the secondary plan development. So that official plan, secondary plan development will include the discussion, and I think it's really important to get it on the table and to get some input from the community at that stage of the planning process. Those various meetings, statutory, non-statutory meetings, put it on the table, have it discussed through your community processes, and that will help. You'll tease out what is of real concern to the community, where you can have a win-win. That's been very important to have that discussion. And then, after that, I think what was really important was developing that official plan framework with the input of stakeholders, but then also having the more, I'd say, it's more of a nuanced discussion with the industry, with the development community, with some of the more sophisticated community stakeholders, ratepayers, different communities of interest to develop that protocol, that Section 37 protocol, and to make that council policy. That protocol is a council policy. It's not a statutory thing. It's more of a council policy. It's not a planning act thing. But having that council support on that protocol, that implementation guideline, matched with that community input on the secondary plan that led you to the community benefits, I think the combination of the two, which involves community input, varying degrees of community input, more on this, probably more on figuring out what the benefits are on this transit group that I mentioned before, to the question from Councillor Scully. We consult with them and say, is this an appropriate use of the funds? Is this appropriate use of the Section 37 funds? And so I think that's very helpful, is to get those, get the ridership up. It's really important actually too, when you think about it, if people walk into a building and the building is, it's a smart building, they can see when the bus is on its way in there, there's monitors at the bottom of it, they know when it's all coming, they walk in, they have a pass from day one, they have a pass, they have the amenity, they have a good safe place to sit and wait for the bus to come. I think that's one of the things that we found has been helpful in trying to increase the ridership. Again, I don't know the exact percentage on these modal splits, and they are very specific. Everyone's got a transit study to support whatever modal split they're seeking. But it's one of these things that has been helpful in getting some of those buildings from day one on transit and getting them using our services.
Okay, thank you for your questions, and I'll take the chair back. And are there any other questions? Seeing none. Again, John, thank you so much for coming, and I know you need to rush back. Councillor Farr, Councillor Skelly, all those in favor? Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. That have to do with the Section 37 bonusing. So as you're probably aware, the general prohibition against bonusing comes from the Municipal Act, Section 106, and that section basically says that the municipality shall not assist a commercial or business enterprise through the granting of bonuses. And it does set out some of what it considers bonusing in subsection 2, you'll see there on the screen. But generally it is providing assistance to those businesses or enterprises. On the other hand, what is permitted in Section 37, which we've been talking about at length this morning, is more of an exchange where the increase in height or density is being offered in exchange for some other matter, such as facility services that we've discussed this morning. So unlike sort of a traditional bonus where just money or an exemption from paying fees or something is given, this is actually getting something in return for a benefit. Now, what the requirements of the legislation say, and we've discussed this morning, is that there needs to be policies set out in the OP, and my understanding is we have some basic policies, but further work needs to be done, and certainly, and as I'll discuss through this, I do think setting up procedures and mechanisms for implementing the use of bonusing within the municipality is appropriate. And what exists today in the Planning Act is a permission that we can do it is pending proclamation. So this bill actually adds another set of sections. So it doesn't change what was on the previous screen. It doesn't change this. What it does is actually add sections. So one of those things was that the municipality be required to keep a special account that sets out all the monies that are received for Section 37 benefits. And it talks about what can that money be used for in the interim, so we can use it for investments just like other monies under the Municipal Act. But this now will require the treasurer to keep a statement of that account. And for each year, make that available. You'll see that at subsection 10 to the public, and upon the request of the minister, we'd be providing that statement there. Subsection 8 does set out all of the statements that the treasurer will be required to put in that. There was quite a bit of discussion through the, while the bill was pending about why this was necessary, and it was in part to provide some transparency to the process. There was, correctly or incorrectly, some concern from the development industry that monies that were being received by municipalities for Section 37 benefits were not necessarily being used in the way that they were contemplated to be used for. So this, I think, is giving the public a little bit more understanding about what is being received and how it is being used from year to year. Just before I move on, so in terms of the process, typically, as I said, this has received royal assent. These will not come into force until they are proclaimed by the Lieutenant Governor. That, as a matter of tradition, legislative tradition, is usually July 1st or January 1st. So it could be as soon as this July, it could be in the future, at the beginning of 2017. So in terms of these matters going to the board has given some sort of key highlights or has given comments through various decisions that give us the key. In essence, and you've heard from the speakers this morning, there needs to be protocols setting out how we go about calculating what is going to be required as part of the Section 37, whether that be the matters or services or cash for that purpose. The board has been very clear that they don't like if that is applied arbitrarily. So particularly between developments or even while looking at a particular development, there needs to be a methodology there. And certainly we heard from the speakers this morning that that is something that other municipalities who are using these on a day-to-day basis are really looking at putting together a robust plan to ensure that it's not an arbitrary decision that is made through a single development's application process. The other comment from the board is that this is not meant to be a tax tool. They have been clear that the Planning Act is not a revenue generating tool for the municipality, but instead, and as was discussed, it is meant to be a connection between the benefit that the municipality is receiving and the increase in height or density that is being provided. So through that process, you have a methodology that provides clarity for council, for the public, for the developer of how that will be determined, what benefits the municipality will be looking for, and demonstrating what the connection is between the benefit that is being received and the actual height or density increase that is being permitted. That stems back from a decision at the outset of the use of this in 2000, and the board had said along the lines of the contributions that whether or not those contributions are authorized must be judged on the beneficial effects of the proposal. So for example, and I think we heard briefly about this, if, say, the increase in density was going to cause there to be not enough daycare in the neighborhood, then perhaps benefits, facilities, or contributions to daycares in the neighborhood to increase that capacity would be appropriate. Or say if an increase in height was going to shadow a park, you could have benefits related to the park's improvement or other facilities in the area so that there is a continued availability of park services for those residents. In terms of what the benefits could be, you saw there's long lists of things that are articulated in various official plans where they are using a Section 37 benefits. It's fairly broad. The legislation just refers to facilities, services, or matters, which really could capture anything. The board, again, has wanted to see there be a connection, and that's really what the test is a connection or nexus to what the increase is. But at one point in time, there was an argument about whether even cash could be taken for it, and that's obviously very settled, and Bill 73 even speaks to that and articulating how that process or how those monies should be handled. But even conveyance of land, that has been clearly articulated by the board as being appropriate. That's just a high-level overview of these, the legal issues. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Yep, thank you. I do have Councillor Collins.
Thank you. The question I have is, it relates to our incentive programs that we have currently. So I had the opportunity to ask our planning staff, of all the developments we have downtown, and we see cranes here for the first time in 30 or 40 years. Lots of activity, we're breaking development records, but there isn't a high-density development in the core that hasn't been constructed with the assistance of the city's incentive programs. And so we're essentially subsidizing, to an extent, those developments that have taken place. So I try to reconcile, and I think you mentioned it here in terms of, go back to your slide, where you talked about the policies related to how we establish them locally, and we need to expand and elaborate on those programs in terms of determining who's eligible. So I'm trying to understand how we allow people to take advantage of our incentive programs, but at the same time, we may be taking something in return for higher densities, and maybe that's a planning question rather than a legal question. How do we reconcile those two issues? We are incentivizing the development of high-density residential in the core, and at the same time, Section 37 may allow someone to come in using those incentive programs, and at the same time return resources to the municipality, allowing for higher densities. Probably, maybe not a legal issue, but it's an issue for me.
Certainly, through you, Madam Chair, the bonusing process is an optional one, and it's often seen in municipalities where the developers have a desire to, build, construct, develop beyond what is already permitted in the zoning, and there may be financial incentives already existing for the developers to want to undertake that process and provide the municipality with benefits in order to obtain that further density or height. Often the incentive programs are sort of the opposite side of that coin, to incentivize developers to come and just build, in accordance with what already exists today. So in terms of reconciling that, they're often meant for two different purposes, and I'm happy to allow planning to speak to how those would operate together for planning approvals.
So through the chair, I think that the councillor has hit on an important point, and a point that makes at least the utilization of these tools in the downtown core of Hamilton potentially different than some of the precedents that have been put before you, in that we've heard this morning about Vaughan, about Mississauga, Burlington, Toronto. In those situations, the development that's happening there isn't happening under the auspices of some of the incentive programs, DC reductions that we have, at least in our downtown core. So I think that is an important point and an important consideration in how this tool might work in Hamilton, in that a lot of the activity we're seeing is in large part thanks to some of those programs that the city has put in place. So what would then layering a bonusing regime on top of that then look like, and how would you, in the councillor's words, reconcile that? I think it's an important, unique nuance, I think, in how these tools might get applied, at least in the downtown core of Hamilton.
Thanks for that, Jason. So what's next for us in terms of providing direction in reconciling the two sides of the coin? I think it's, we're different than Toronto and everything happening in the GTA, where they're talking about caps and struggling to control really growth that's occurring unchecked. And here, although we have tremendous numbers as it relates to new development, and we're establishing new records for building department levels of investment, and we're certainly seeing higher densities, we're not experiencing those same pressures that Toronto and others are experiencing. And our projects are only happening in large part because those carrots that we have within the department, and we've all supported those, and they're there for good reason. Somehow, I don't know from a policy perspective how we sort that out, and I don't know what staff is contemplating informally or formally at this point in terms of trying to reconcile the whole issue of incentivizing development versus this whole issue of the bonusing and the reverse payments that then come to the municipality. Can I ask through you to Jason?
Jason?
What are we doing from a policy perspective to deal with that issue?
So through the chair, I'll start, and then I'm going to ask Steve to weigh in on sort of where we're at with some of the thinking on bonusing. It has been being sort of developed and thought through originally as part of the tall building guidelines, and making sure that as we're looking at our tall building policies, are we having those policies be, for lack of a better word, bonus ready? And are we looking at them through the lens of potentially applying bonusing related to tall buildings? I'll let Steve speak to that process and where we're at with developing that policy. I think there will be two key questions before this council in terms of how this might work in Hamilton. One is the very important question of just the methodology, the formulas, the policies. As has been said many times this morning, an ad hoc approach is certainly not advised. So how do you actually, who's doing the negotiation, what formulas are applying, all those sorts of things we don't have yet in place. And so a lot of the thinking has been focused on those sorts of questions. The second big question then is where in the city and under what thresholds. So that I don't have any comments to give at this point in terms of where and what thresholds might be suitable in Hamilton, but those really are the two key questions. So with that, I'll turn to Steve to talk about sort of where we're at so far in terms of thinking through what that policy approach might look like in the city.
Thank you.
Steve?
Through you, Madam Chairman, building on Mr. Thorne's comments, one of the challenges is the current policy framework. Often it's very permissive. So within the downtown, for example, you can increase the height without necessarily triggering the need for an official plan amendment, subject to a wind study and a sun shadow study. So you can go from essentially what was originally identified for a low-rise building to a high-rise building without triggering a need for an official plan amendment. So the work on the tall building guidelines is to help inform the policy direction so that we can better provide clarity and direction to people that if there is going to be a proposal involving an increase in height and or density, then would it then trigger the need for an official plan amendment or a zoning amendment, and or would it also then follow up with the opportunities to look at the opportunities for bonusing, and then as we sort of develop that policy framework, rolling it out further across the city. So it's also between looking at some of the market opportunities, the market intelligence, as well as the current official plan policy designations. I think one of the challenges you have is bonusing has to apply. The first test is it has to be good planning. Regardless of whether you use Section 37 or not, the proposal must represent good planning. So if it does represent good planning to, say, have an 8-story building along Main Street, then do you designate it for only 6 and say you go to 8 subject to a bonusing provision, or do you say that we're just going to allow 8 stories as of right? So these are sort of the discussions and the challenges that we're having, and that's why we're looking for the experiences in other municipalities that are more in a comparable situation, where they want to both promote growth as well as manage growth, and then how would that policy framework evolve? So I think that's going to start evolving into as we start rewriting the downtown secondary plan and looking at other opportunities for updating our official plan policies around this so that we can provide very clear, transparent rules to individuals that when they're looking at acquiring a property, they will know whether or not if they want to increase the height or density, then what would be those sort of bonusing requirements the city would be looking at, and that would be applicable beyond just the downtown area.
Councillor?
Thanks. My last question would be, in that context, again, the Toronto developments are a lot different than what we experience here in Hamilton. Big developments for us are 8, 10, 12, 15 stories. In Toronto, they're talking about 40, 50, 60-story buildings, and they're very common. In fact, I think I read right now, Toronto has 20 plus applications right now for 40 or more story buildings. And so, again, the bonusing that comes with those developments and the applicants who seek higher densities on those projects pale in comparison to what we would experience here. And you use somebody wants to go from a 6 to an 8 or an 8 to a 10. I mean, the Section 37 gets us what in that context?
Thank you. Joanna?
A bike rack?
I think in terms of those heights and that change, I mean, that is sort of some of the experience of Richmond Hill, and you heard some comments about that earlier in terms of the density increases. But in terms of sort of what you get for that, the answer really comes down to what are the protocols in place and what were the things that this council, as opposed to what Toronto or Vaughan or other municipalities are looking for, would expect to see in terms of those increases in height. So it's hard to say, well, what would you get for it until we've gone through that process to determine what would be appropriate to get for it.
Thank you, Councillor. Planning, can we have your opinion on
Through you, Madam Chairman, I would suggest we might want to take a look at, say, the City of Ottawa model, where they've actually have two sort of zones where they do their bonusing. Within their downtown core, they have a different sort of bonusing evaluation as to what that increase in height and density would be, as to other parts of Ottawa, which might be much more suburban. So they sort of will look at it from that lens, that you may have, or even in Toronto, like along Shepherd Avenue, where you have the mid-rise development occurring, you're getting something, which would, you're getting 100% of something, or you might be better off getting 80% of something as opposed to 100% of nothing. So it would just be one more tool that the city could put into its toolkit when negotiating that. It may be community facilities within the building, if you're having the redevelopment. It may be an opportunity for additional open space. It may be public art, or it may be affordable housing, or contribution towards an affordable housing payment within, say, a housing submarket zone. We know that in different areas of the city, we have those 5 or 6 different housing market zones, and there are often various levels of affordability needs within those different zones. So that would be the type of policy regime we could look at. So maybe in the downtown area, we want to encourage certain things. In other areas where we're trying to use, say, less encouragement is required, then in those cases, a bonusing regime may make sense. And that would be something that we would be looking at. We do know that there are different markets within the Hamilton area, and some markets might be able to better absorb these sort of bonusing costs, provide that people know going into it, than other areas we're trying to encourage and promote policies and other goals and objectives. So I think that's sort of the lens that we want to look at it on a go-forward basis.
Thank you, Councillor.
For me, it's about tempering expectations in terms of, we're a different market than Toronto, and I don't expect, in a perfect world, I mean, I'd love to see those types of developments in terms of the densities, the construction activity, the jobs, everything that comes with it. We haven't seen it yet. It's going to be here at some point in time in the future, but it isn't here now. So the fact that we're in the early stages of developing a policy framework to deal with it ahead of that wave, whenever it does come, I think is it's a good thing. And if staff need direction today, I guess my final question would be, do they need direction today to start working on those issues, those unresolved issues, or is that happening as part of their work plan for 2016 and 17?
Asking planning staff?
Yep.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman, it's already part of our work plan, so we don't need any specific direction to do any more further investigation on this matter.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Pearson, okay. So Councillor Collins, it's okay. Councillor Collins, can you please take the chair? Through you to Joanna, if you can go back a couple of slides for me, please. One more, there it is. Your last bullet point, there should be a nexus, which I thought was always a card to get me over to USA. Relationship between the height, density increase, and the benefit. So, to be clear, is it very specific that it has to be used in that immediate area of that particular development?
Generally speaking, that is what the board looks at when they're looking at whether a benefit is something they would approve.
Okay, thank you. And so my idea of a neighborhood and your idea of a neighborhood could be total polar opposites. So who decides the boundary? So I want to come in, I'm going to put up a massive building, but I've now got this agreement with the Section 37. What's the boundary of where this money, especially the cash in lieu, I think that's where my main concern is, because usually facilities are built close and on the property, but it's the cash in lieu that, how do we ensure it stays within that community? What are the boundaries?
The board hasn't looked at it in terms of boundaries. What they've said is so what you're proposing to use that cash for, does that thing, whatever that might be, relate to, is there a nexus to the increase in height or density that was permitted? So in terms of where the effects or the relationship is, that defines the area, and it could differ based on what the matter, the thing, the benefit, the service was that is being granted. And unfortunately, it's very fact specific, so it's hard to give a just general test for that.
Okay, thank you, because I think if the policy is too vague, there can be so many spins on it that before you know it, that the community receives nothing, because it ends up being outside, and it's, because you can actually correlate, this is why it would be good for the community, because this community over here. So that's where my concern is. Can we, as a municipality, look at that policy and be a little bit, tighten up the language so that it does, in fact, if Councillor Farr is going to end up having a massive development, that the Section 37 cash in lieu is benefiting that community and that neighborhood and not going somewhere on Mount Hope. I mean, this is where my argument, question.
Certainly that can be considered through the process, and making that clear and transparent is certainly what the board looks for when they're looking at whether a Section 37 benefit is appropriate or not.
Thank you. And it also helps, in my opinion, to when you're doing public consultations, you know, this is what we're going to benefit from this. If this is coming in, we get this. So it really does help the yin and yang. So thank you very much, Joanna, for your questions and your presentation. I'll take the chair back. Thank you, Councillor Collins. Councillor Vanderbeek, sorry, I didn't see your hand up earlier.
Thank you. So, through you, Madam Chair, can you tell me if the City of Toronto has been challenged? So the wording that I have here is, in the specific case of affordable housing as a community benefit, the appropriate geographic relationship is considered to be citywide. The location of affordable housing as a community benefit can be anywhere in the city or is otherwise specified. And so do you know whether that's been challenged as a neighborhood benefit at the OMB?
I'm not aware, no.
Councillor?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And no other questions, Joanna. Thank you very much for your presentation. May I have a motion, please, to approve the presentation? Councillor Conley, Councillor Vanderbeek, all those in favor? Last but not least, last on the agenda, number one in our hearts, is Mr. Edward John, City of Hamilton, inclusionary zoning. Yes?
Thank you for that very warm welcome. It's been a while. It's exciting to be back in front of the Horseshoe, so thank you. I will do my best for the billing. Just for those who don't know me, I'm Edward John, planner here at City of Hamilton. I have over 15 years experience in development planning, 10 of those in this great city of ours here in Hamilton. Before Hamilton, I did plan in UK and Australia, and with some particular relevance to this discussion topic, I've actually some first-hand experience in implementing and applying inclusionary zoning as it comes through the development approvals process. My presentation is somewhat more informal, so feel free to jump in at any point if you have questions or in need of clarification. Once again, this is a high-level overview. There's been a lot of focus on inclusionary zoning, a lot of discussion. I think part of this presentation is to kind of keep that discussion going. I mean, there's not going to be all the answers today, particularly for the Hamilton context, but hopefully we'll give some added information to those discussions as they go forward. So let's begin at the beginning. What is inclusionary zoning? So one of the most often cited definitions appears here on the screen. It refers to a zoning regulation that requires developers of projects of a certain size to produce a set amount of affordable housing as a condition of development approval. Quite simply, it allows the city to mandate a set number of units on the basis of a development approval. I think it's also important today, given the discussion that we have had on bonusing, is to kind of set out some parameters why inclusionary zoning is different to bonusing. I mean, some of the questions we've heard from council, and certainly some of the answers we've heard, is that bonusing negotiations are not necessarily clear and transparent and are based on a site-by-site basis. and therefore the outcome is not necessarily certain. There's also a large array of community benefit options that are available to the developer as they go through a bonusing negotiation. And as you can imagine, affordable housing, typically because of the complexity in providing it, is at the very bottom of that list for obvious reasons. And once again, we had this through the discussions, but through bonusing, you are limited to the extent of the bonus. So when you consider something as significant as affordable housing, the amount that you can actually precipitate through calculating the bonus is not necessarily providing affordable housing in significant numbers. Certainly from the experience with inclusionary zoning, it certainly has had its criticism, but has provided more consistently affordable housing through the development process. Just a quick recap on why have inclusionary zoning. I think it's important to really understand the why as we go into the next phase of potentially the how. As we're all aware, the housing wait list currently, I think they're sitting just over 5,700 households. That list is going in one direction, and unfortunately it is up with increasing real estate values, buoyant, particularly in this community. Gentrification. So in the UK and Australia and US, inclusionary zoning has been used to quite good effect to deal with the negative consequences of gentrification. I may digress quickly. I do see Renee Wetzler from the Social Planning Council here in the crowd, and I did mention to her on Housing Day how in Hamilton, how wonderful it would be to actually have gentrification as a positive term, and that we can actually deal with those negative consequences which have so unfortunately dealt with the term itself. This social justice, so obviously the increase of affordable housing units, but also this aspect of removing NIMBYism, because through the inclusionary zoning process, the geographical location of those units is not discretionary. Smart growth. Inclusionary zoning does put an emphasis on density and increasing the density of communities, which would obviously complement this prospect of smart growth. There's also a lot of discussion on integration. So mixed-use buildings, reducing the stigma, overcoming generational poverty, which is often cited as one of the main benefits of an inclusionary zoning proposal. Similar with economic diversity, the ability to take the market out of the equation obviously reduces any potential for concentrations of affordable housing because they're spread out as and consistent with the growth of the community. The reduced funding, as we're all aware, the municipalities have had downloaded the housing for several decades now and are struggling certainly to keep up with the rising demand and the issues we're having with our existing stock. Inclusionary zoning has been discussed as an ability to leverage high growth markets. I will caveat that statement because through any inclusionary zoning process, there's always give and take. There's an element of planning gain that is provided to the developer of a project in exchange for that added density and for the affordable housing units. And then finally, innovation. I think it would be remiss not to mention obviously the slides that you'll see today are all affordable housing projects which really demonstrate and reduce the stigma of what affordable housing looks like and can look like when all collaboration is made. I think it's important at this point also to just really highlight and manage expectations on inclusionary zoning. I mean, this is a very important list in which to address, but to place this on the back of inclusionary zoning would be inappropriate and unsuccessful. Inclusionary zoning is not a panacea to the housing shortlist waitlists or the housing concerns that we have citywide. Really, it's best used as a complementary tool to the vast array of tools that we're already employing in order to tackle this community-wide issue. I'd also mention that often a limitation cited for inclusionary zoning is this aspect that in most successful programs, it's really dealing with the top end of affordability, the moderate incomes. Very rarely do inclusionary zoning programs delve deep into social housing. And just by means of the complexities inherent in the process, in the absence of additional subsidy, it's very difficult to address that portion of the economic environment. So when will it be implemented? We're all aware of the ministry in their update to the Ontario's long-term housing strategy that inclusionary zoning was mentioned, and it's created a great deal of excitement. It should be noted at this point we are not able to implement inclusionary zoning until the legislative requirements have been put forward by the ministry. Those requirements would give municipalities the ability to obviously not only legislate the amount of affordable units, but ensure that they are affordable in the long term. The ministry have mentioned, though, and have been quite clear that this will be an enabling framework. And what that means is that given the vast array of municipalities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, municipalities will be able to elect whether they adopt or not inclusionary zoning. If adopted, obviously, there will be recognition that official plan policies and zoning bylaws may have to change just to obviously identify and provide clarity as to how the program will be implemented. And this brings us on to how will it be implemented. The ministry have made it quite clear that all the rules and strategies involved in creating an inclusionary zoning framework have to be clear, transparent, and consistent. Through the bonusing discussion we heard today and through much of the literature, one of the concerns with bonusing is that lack of transparency, the fact it's subject to individual site negotiation. If inclusionary zoning is implemented, the benefits will have to be clear and upfront and mandated to that effect. There's also, before I move on, the idea of financial reasonableness. This is quite implicit in the process, and it speaks to the planning gain that inclusionary zoning must create. It simply cannot be implemented as a tax. It is a tool, not a tax. The fear of implementing this as a tax is obviously that it will stagnate the growth that municipalities have received in housing, and the fear that all those additional costs will be borne quite possibly by the market, and fortunately by ironically creating less affordability at the top end of units. So moving on to how the program should be structured. Quite clearly we need to define affordable housing. There's a number of definitions, but inclusionary zoning will need its own specific reason to address which component of that spectrum it will deal with. Similarly, it will have to target certain income groups. There is a possibility that it could keep that target income group quite wide, but the wider that group, the more difficult and cumbersome it is to implement the program. One of the main talking points, particularly for Hamilton, will be the threshold. At what point is inclusionary zoning triggered? I know back in the UK, it was anything over 10 units was 10% affordable housing. Obviously, that threshold has to really reflect the housing market and how robust that housing market is to accommodate the threshold. You are going to see vast differences to how Toronto implement the threshold and the units set aside compared to Hamilton. There's also this aspect of control periods. This will probably be determined by the ministry, but we will then need to ensure effectively that those units maintain affordability for the long term. We will also have to decide the unit type, rental or ownership. Once again, many of the programs that are available today focus on affordable home ownership, once again to reduce some of the complexities inherent in the framework. That being said, affordable rental certainly can be an option. There are just additional monitoring and review exercises that would need to be done in order to ensure that is facilitated correctly. And then finally, the cost offsets or incentives. This is where it becomes somewhat confusing with the process of bonusing because it sounds a lot like bonusing. Remember that if it is inclusionary zoning, it is mandated, so they may be forced with this prospect of having, let's keep the example, anything over 10 units is 10%. What you would do through the cost offsets was try to ensure that any pro forma working on a particular site makes financial sense. Nothing will occur without financial sense reigning forward. Some of those examples which the ministry have provided include density, increasing the density, reducing certain bylaw standards as parking, and streamlining the approvals process. So that takes us to specific considerations for Hamilton. So the economic impacts on local housing markets. Similar to rent control, critics often raise concern that this will actually stagnate the market, stagnate growth, and place additional burdens in terms of cost onto the market purchases. So therefore, there needs to be robust studies reviewing exactly the nature of the housing market and the needs of that housing market. With regards to economic feasibility, successful programs, I mean, this is consistent with my research and my own experience, really are hinged on collaboration with the development industry. I mean, that's a key component of making this function, is making sure that there is that justification from an economic standpoint. Their thresholds need to be responsible and reasonable and implementable. Another consideration for Hamilton is this aspect of competition with similar municipalities. As I mentioned earlier, the province are looking at this to be an enabling framework, so the chances are there are going to be some municipalities who may not elect to adopt inclusionary zoning, may not elect it in the short term, maybe have longer term visions. So, what position will that place Hamilton in with respect to neighbouring municipalities which may have similar development opportunities? I think, as a high-level response to that, it really emphasizes the importance of a planning gain for the developer so that he can really make a financial argument as to why it makes sense in Hamilton. Another important consideration is Hamilton's varied geography. It's very different to the Torontos of this world, which predominantly will be dealing with multiple dwelling developments. Hamilton has a rural, suburban, and urban area. One program that fits all is hugely unlikely. Hamilton will then have to decide whether they only implement inclusionary zoning for certain areas, or maybe even have different frameworks for different portions of the city. And then finally, the intended approach. There's been a lot of discussion as to what inclusionary zoning shall create. I think when you look at the term inclusionary, is that there's a level of integration. But there's an argument to really look at whether the city would be interested in sheer unit numbers, what's the best bang for the buck, or whether you're looking at economic integration, which is a component of really ensuring that each building at a certain threshold incorporates those affordable units. So in terms of next steps, there's a lot of work to be done. I think even with the ministry saying that they're going to do some extensive consultation, we here at the city should certainly be looking and doing some policy analysis. Much of the policy analysis was actually back at the early 2000s when inclusionary zoning in North America and particularly Canada started to becoming a very discussed topic. And certainly in the upcoming months, there's going to be far more analysis that takes place, and we should obviously familiarize ourselves with that. We should be looking and determining local conditions and affordable housing needs. This program, if it is to be implemented, needs, in my opinion, to be tailored. The more tailored it is, the more chance of success and the more financially reasonable it can become. There's an aspect of monitoring and administration that will come inherent with this process. Making sure that those ultimately who receive the units are those who most likely need it and continue to need it. So there's a monitoring aspect as well as a monitoring aspect of the unit itself as it changes either occupation or ownership. And once again, we should certainly emphasize the fact that this is part of a larger comprehensive housing strategy. In and by itself, it certainly will fail to succeed in all the discussions that I've had to date in terms of its intended role. And then as I come to my final thought, feel free to criticize this because this is me and me alone. But personally, I think when it comes to inclusionary zoning, it shall refer not only to the end user, but the entire process. If it's to be successful, it should be one that draws upon the innovation and collaboration of the industry as a whole through extensive consultation, through robust understanding of local housing markets, and certainly through an investigative process that we take forward. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, John. Edward, John, I do have a list, so I hope you're comfortable.
Absolutely.
Councillor Farr.
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, thank you, Ed, for the work you've done so far, and likely much more to come, and specifically to your inclusionary zoning and your personal history in that area. I was intrigued to hear. I didn't realize that in London it's 10% after 10 units, which is probably, I would guess, through you, one of the greatest examples of inclusionary zoning in the world.
Through the chair to the councillor. In fact, I checked back recently, it's now 50% of anything over 10 units. Understanding that the development and the markets are very much different, but certainly it's progressive. But I should caveat too that, London, particularly North London, still has a housing crisis. So, once again, the extent to which inclusionary zoning can solve those problems needs to be managed in terms of expectations.
And to that, and another thing that harkened in my mind was that London is probably one of the greatest cities, if not the greatest city, in terms of just real estate values. Is that a fact?
Through the chair to the councillor, I don't have any definitive empirical information, but anecdotally, yes, that's my opinion.
So, Madam Chair, when you say, quote, very rarely a development will get deep into the social housing side when it comes to inclusionary zoning, is that part of the matrix then? Is that the reason why you would suggest that here?
Edward?
Through the chair, if I understand the question correctly, most programs that are in place often do not deal with social housing, so the subsidy level of housing. They deal with a matrix which looks at home ownership or rental that is affordable, but typically 30%, similar to the PPS and our current Urban Hamilton official plan thresholds, but it deals with that top end of affordability. It doesn't go down without the addition of additional subsidy to the social housing component.
Councillor?
Sorry, as it relates through you, Chair, to Ed, as it relates to places in the world where real estate is at a major peak, like London, England, we're talking about London, England, that is also the case then?
Through the chair to the councillor, yes, I'm speaking now 10 years in the past, things may have changed, but the implementation of inclusionary zoning was actually looking very much at that top end element. There was still a very strong focus on service providers and other means in which to deal with social housing.
Councillor?
Okay, so you were talking about looking at it in terms of the geographical areas, and through you, Chair, certainly here, and I say quite often that quite proud to be the councillor in Ward 2, where there's no argument. We have been the most inclusive. We have the most social housing. We have the most units, and we continue to work at this gentrification issue in different ways. It's a big conversation now, but also when we have our community conversations on West Harbour, we make a pledge to the public that there'll be a net gain of affordable housing in the Setting Sail secondary plan area, for example, just one of the latest announcements here in Ward 2. But looking at it as a whole, and then kind of contemplating things like being a second-term city housing board member, and understanding that a lot of the times the folks that are applying, that are on this increasing wait list, and I'm glad you mentioned that, are not applying to live in Ward 2, they're applying to live elsewhere, other parts of the city of Hamilton. So, in parts where perhaps the zoning is more comparable to, a low-rise residential or suburban development. I'm trying to put the two together in how, if it's effective, in your view, it's on the spectrum of the affordable housing scale of affordable home ownership, maybe granny flats, those sorts of things, living in place, aging in place. How do you accommodate the need in areas where you can't really build up, through you, Chair?
Through the chair to the councillor. So I'll unpack that question in two parts. Hopefully I will address both. In terms of the applicability of inclusionary zoning to the suburbs, certainly the US have many examples where single-family detached dwellings have been included in inclusionary zoning programs. So it's not necessarily narrowly defined as only dealing with your urban areas with your multiple dwellings. There's a great deal more questions when you start having two different approaches, which I mentioned in my presentation. And then the second part of that is that Yeah, certainly there's going to have to be an understanding of local housing markets when you deal with inclusionary zoning citywide. There's a suggestion too that certain suburban areas or rural areas for that matter may not be that best accommodated for certain elements when it comes to transit, when it comes to schools and other matters which may be a pressing need in the affordable housing spectrum. So that too would have to feed into how you design that program. I'm not sure if I caught your question, but perfect, thank you.
Primarily, Madam Chair, is I wanted to hear that it's not just urban areas. It's when we're talking about inclusionary zoning, we're not just talking about added density to larger developments, medium or higher density developments. It can be in a rural, or maybe not rural, but an urban expansion area or a suburban neighborhood.
Through the chair to the councillor, certainly they would have a different approach, but that's a possibility. And certainly the reverse to that, and only having it in the urban areas, there is a concern there that what you're actually doing indirectly is encouraging greater suburban sprawl, because for want of a better term, you may have inclusionary zoning in your downtown, so many developers are looking elsewhere where they don't have to be a part of that inclusionary zoning. So inadvertently you may be creating some suburban sprawl. So there is an argument to make sure that it's in some way consistent, understanding the very different and separate housing markets that exist across the city.
Well, that just speaks to through your tailored comment. You could still have it, but it'd be tailored differently in a suburban area as opposed to a downtown, but ultimately trying to achieve that goal. And again, the focus is, through you, Chair, on less on social housing when we're talking about inclusionary zoning, more on that part of or the piece of the affordable housing spectrum, which is a broad spectrum on the side that sees affordable home ownership or RGIs even and those sorts of things. So that can happen anywhere. And if it needs to be tailored differently, that's fine. But it's an interesting concept. I know you have much more work to do. And just to quickly comment, I'm certain that around this table we've heard, the Waterdown councillor not long ago, Councillor Partridge, talking about her needs in her community, and there's a long way to go to achieve those needs. And certainly we want to do whatever we can as a planning body, as a committee, and ultimately as a council to address needs in places like Waterdown. And I hear you, transit's an issue, and we got to work on that separately, and other issues. But if there's a desire and there's a part of that affordability spectrum, there's people out there that have that desire, then we have to do whatever we can to make that work in those places and consider it maybe tailored, but a citywide issue. Excellent, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, and it's been very enjoyable working with Ed on the housing file, and as is evident with his presentation, he's very knowledgeable when it comes to these policies, how they've worked and haven't worked in other areas of the world. So Ed, appreciate all of your assistance with that. I do have a question related to Councillor Farr's, and that is the whole issue related to the RGI versus affordable home ownership. And when I followed social media and the media stories, when the province announced that they were giving serious consideration to policy changes and allowing municipalities to look at implementing inclusionary zoning, there was all kinds of celebration that this means thousands of extra units for Hamilton in particular over the next number of years, because it means 15, 10%, 5% of all new home builds or residential unit builds will be affordable, which, as Councillor Farr has pointed out, there's a pretty big spectrum there in terms of what is affordable, from home ownership to rent geared to income unit. Your experience in other places, is that too ambitious to think that we're looking at thousands of units for affordable housing as part of whatever policy changes come from the province and may subsequently then be approved by the city?
Through the chair to the councillor, thousands of units, I think certainly that's ambitious. I speak to the importance of really understanding the appropriate and reasonable threshold for Hamilton in particular, in which, if it ever was applied, inclusionary zoning was applied. We have Jennifer Keesmaat in Toronto talking about developments over 200 units. as we go through the amount of units and developments that we've had here in the city, and I've dealt with a few of the very high density ones, I think only one in my knowledge has actually exceeded that value. And understanding that when you deal with a unit count above 200, it's very easy to get more towards that financial reasonableness because you're spreading the value across a greater number of units. I'm excited about inclusionary zoning. I think it plays a very important part. I think some of the most important parts it plays is just keeping the negotiation and discussion of affordable housing in the front of everyone's minds. The actual implemented social housing units that are created through this process, the empirical evidence, although it's varied, would say that that's difficult. There is a concept of what's called urban filtering, so you focus on the top end of affordability and hopefully that frees up some of the units below. That has too come under great criticism. But once again, I think as Hamilton goes through this process of reviewing whether this will work, if not now, maybe in the future, we'll get to that point of determining what means success for Hamilton.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thanks for that. And I'm surprised that the province hasn't established or hasn't created a policy that applies across the province. And you raised some points in your presentation that speak to the whole issue of competitiveness. Those municipalities that choose not to adopt an inclusionary zoning policy might stand a better chance of encouraging new investment in their communities because there's a lower cost for the developer. Those that maybe deem it as important in terms of addressing our social housing needs or even affordable home ownership to an extent may be at a disadvantage because we are now forcing something upon the development community they may not want to build. So it makes sense to do this across the province, so we're all working on a level playing field, but it seems as though they'll allow municipalities to pick and choose what programs they have and how they'll be implemented. How do we wrestle with that on a go-forward basis, knowing that we may have others around us who choose not to adopt it, and I know where Hamilton Council and our community wants to go, but if others don't do the same, how does that help or hurt us?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, first and foremost, I would give recognition to the wonderful work City of Hamilton staff and the community have done in placing Hamilton in a position that truly is the place to invest right now. I think we need to continue that focus. I think in terms of that aspect of being at a competitive disadvantage to potentially other municipalities that do not have inclusionary zoning, I think the focus is to really deal with the idea of planning gain. So through the inclusionary zoning framework, really provide meaningful incentives to which could actually entice the developers to stay and participate in that program. It is interesting. Hamilton is in a difficult place, as we've mentioned today, because we do incentivize a lot as it stands. And, when we look at some of the, I'll just move to it now, cost offsets, density, parking reductions, streamlined approvals process. The Connolly went through, I think, in 127 days, the Tivoli, 118 days. We're making great efforts to provide this to bring developers to Hamilton today. So is it going to be complicated to really provide some meaningful incentives? Absolutely. But, Hamilton's always up for a challenge.
Great. I appreciate all your hard work again, Edward, and planning staff in general. I know the whole department, as well as our housing staff, have been very proactive related to this file and others, so thank you for that.
Thank you, Councillor Skelly.
Thank you. Through the chair, could you explain to me, I understand how market rental units would work, but how does it, how would it apply to purchasing a home?
Through the chair to the councillor, that will actually need to be determined through the process. Certainly my experience in London, UK, when it came to the affordable home ownership, there was a separate housing providing service that maintained the unit over time. So, for instance, of a condo, some of the big arguments is a condo developer builds the building, he's gone, and only the tenants or the owners are left. In this situation, you would actually be handing over those units at a reduced value to a housing provider who would then maintain a program to ensure all the end users meet the affordable threshold. So they would have to provide means testing in terms of their income, in order to qualify for those units. They wouldn't be able to sell those units. You would only be able to give back those units to the housing provider, who then, on the next owner, or wouldn't be an owner, potentially long-term renter, would then come in.
Thank you. Through the chair, you're not then suggesting that inclusionary zoning and market ownership would apply in a new subdivision with a home that is a single-family unit?
Through the chair to the councillor, so the U.S. does have examples where it's been applied to single-family dwellings in suburban environments. Once again, it's complicated because of that service management requirement to ensure through legal agreements that that unit stays affordable in the long term. So typically what is done is that a legal agreement is registered, such as a covenant on title, that will at any point in terms in the future when they come to sell it, it would have to be sold as an affordable unit.
Councillor?
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you. As the councillor representing Ward 7, which has actually the second highest number of housing units in the city, one of my observations, and I think they're great neighborhoods, we have a number of affordable housing complexes near Ronald Road and Stonechurch, but one of the big issues is walkability and isolation because of the limited transit. And that community, that ability to get out and walk in your neighborhood. So I would suggest that it's wonderful, but we also have to recognize that that everyone, including people who are looking to have access to affordable housing, also need access to transit. And I think that it's a very obvious problem in that particular part of my work. That's all. Thank you.
Councillor Aidan Johnson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks, Ed, for the presentation. I've been super impressed by all the fabulous work you've been doing on the waterfront, and I'm wondering if you could comment on how inclusionary zoning might relate to the waterfront and the possibilities for social housing there.
Through the chair to the councillor, as I mentioned in my presentation, formally inclusionary zoning is not currently an option today. We don't have the legislative ability to ensure the affordability of the unit over time. What we do have with the waterfront is ownership of the land. So if the desire from council was to include any element of affordable housing on the waterfront, similar to the issues I raised in this presentation, there's going to have to be given some thought as to how, first of all, what percentage of units would go affordable, what section of the spectrum would you gear the units towards, and then finally, how would you secure in the long term that they remain affordable. So for the waterfront, the only slightly rosier picture is that we are the owner of the land, and therefore the ability to regulate some of these requirements is somewhat easier, but there's still a lot of thought that would have to be given to exactly how that program is implemented.
When you say we need to give it thought, what are the relevant concerns that you're referring to or thinking of?
Through the chair to the councillor, once a threshold has been determined, so let's take 5-10% of those units that are to be affordable, the key is to maintaining the fact that they remain affordable. So we'd have to have some legal input to make sure that we can continue that those units forever and a day stay affordable in order to really meet that purpose.
And is that not a question through you, Madam Chair, of contracting and proper contract language?
Through the chair to the councillor, I would seek some legal input. I know that, part of the reason why we're waiting for the ministry to make legislative changes is so that we can actually register covenants that speak to this aspect. I'm not sure how clear it is in the current legal system that we can maintain without challenge those types of covenants on title. And then the other element too is the monitoring. So making sure that we have set up the administration and monitoring of those units, once again, to ensure the long-term affordability.
Madam Chair, would you mind if I directed that question through to Joanna?
Absolutely. Joanna?
Any comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. To my knowledge, I agree with Mr. John. The challenge is what tools do we have in place to ensure that subsequent owners of the property are bound by those, how that's set up. So I'd be interested to see if changes are made in the future to give us better tools to do that.
And do you have any concern, through you, Madam Chair, in a present inability to create contract language that would create the necessary obligation on the part of the landlord/developer? Is it the case that we need some kind of new contractual ability that we don't currently enjoy, and that has to be part of the new laws?
Those types of agreements are typically handled by the real estate lawyers in my department. I will say, though, that those types of requirements that would be registered on title either does need to be explicit provisions in order for us to enforce that for subsequent owners. I'm not aware of any tools that we have at the moment that would allow us to do that.
Councillor?
That's really neat. Neat yet obviously a concern. I'm wondering if, without a motion, simply orally, if I could request that our real estate legal team provide some kind of comment specifically on that question. What do we need that we don't currently have? What are concerns we should be aware of? Is that?
Do we have real estate here, or would you prefer Joanna to?
My understanding from Joanna's answer, which I take as completely appropriate and responsible, is that she's not a real estate specialist, and
I don't
probably
believe
need to go to a
have
specialist.
one. And I don't believe we have a real estate
I meant at a
specialist
future
here.
date. It could even email to me or email to all of council, whatever. But to me, that to me is an important question that we need to think about. So I would make the request.
If at your indulgence, Mr. Thorne would like to respond.
Yes, through the chair, I'm responding because the real estate disposition process for the West Harbour lands, which is sort of the specific example where the councillor's question was related to, is being actually worked on within my department, and that is a question that we're working through with real estate. Is in anticipation, if council wants to require an affordable housing component in the West Harbour lands, what would be the legal mechanism for requiring that from any developer and for maintaining that over time? So we can certainly. I don't have a final answer yet on what that mechanism might be if council wants to take that path, but can certainly maybe try to fast track at least the question of what the tool looks like to respond to the councillor's question.
Thank you, councillor.
That would be great. I mean, good to know that we're on that. That's great. Good. I have a question about tailoring, which is a kind of a lovely word you've brought into our conversation. So I'll cut to my local Ward 1 example. So we heard from Councillor Skelly a good question about, does inclusionary zoning apply to suburbs? And basically I took from your answer that in terms of new suburban housing, we could tailor our inclusionary zoning rules in various ways, from exemption for housing developments in suburbs through to non-exemption. Is that so? Before I go on to my Ward 1 based question, is that an accurate summation of what I heard?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, so I'll caveat all that I say that we really haven't had much information from the ministry in terms of how they would really have us set up the framework for inclusionary zoning. Drawing upon some of the other examples that exist today, I don't think you would use the threshold and the units set aside the same in an urban area as you would a suburban area. Typically, the ability to spread the cost in a high-density multiple dwelling is different to what you can do potentially in a subdivision, depending on the size. But really what it needs is just for someone to really test the markets and understand, are they different markets? What's the most appropriate ways in which to secure inclusionary zoning, understanding the different challenges from an environmental perspective?
Councillor?
Got it. So is it the case that we're anticipating guidelines, suggestions, or binding rules from the ministry? Or is it the case that we've been given as broad a discretion as it sounds like to craft our own rules within the silo of inclusionary zoning?
Through the chair to the councillor, so much of the information on this slide you have before you is pretty much the extent of the information that we've really received from the ministry. At this point, it's been very high-level discussion. I've attended one of their presentations, and I asked a number of questions, and it was clear from the answers that they're still waiting for the consultation to take place before they finalize exactly the information they're going to disseminate to the ministry, to the municipalities. So to that extent, we may have the ability as a municipality to look at all these different program elements and make a decision. And if we're in that position, then it's a very complicated and challenging process that will require a lot of review.
Councillor?
Got it. So we don't know yet is the answer, but right now we're working on possibilities so as to be ready for when we know. Is that accurate?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, certainly I think all the municipalities are now looking towards the implications of inclusionary zoning and particularly how it fits to their own communities.
Got it. So to go to my Ward 1 question, I'm wondering how inclusionary zoning might apply when it comes to new developments targeted specifically at students. Would it be appropriate to suggest that maybe that's an instance where we require what you've been calling tailoring? Question mark. Any comments on student housing in general, these inclusionary?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, through the zoning process, we're actually unable to determine the demographics. So, speak to students versus other elements of the demographic spectrum. Certainly we're looking at land uses. The interesting thing about inclusionary zoning is it does bring into this discussion of affordable housing, which is a segment of that demographic input. But at this point, from a human rights position, it would be very difficult to isolate students and tailor a program just for students under the Planning Act.
Thank you. Councillor?
Okay, very good. And I'll look forward to sort of talking about that question going forward. In the wake of, just informationally, Madam Chair, in the wake of the recent OMB ruling in the case of 111 Winston, it is the case of the relevant human rights argument that thinking about student housing as a unique category is contrary to human rights has gone away. But it does appear, just conversationally, that there may be some chunks being ripped out of that particular argument. That argument is not as strong today as it was a few weeks ago. But we'll look forward. I understand the complexity there. So I'll look forward just to talking about the Ward 1 student housing question and not just student housing question, but student apartment building question as it may relate to inclusionary zoning. What one concern in all that being, just to kind of provide a comment as opposed to a question, I wonder if some of those units might not count as housing for lower income tenants anyway, given that many students fall into the category of lower income. But I say that not with a question mark, but just sort of something to chew on and think about. A further question, through you, Madam Chair. Edward, I really appreciated your references to inclusionary zoning as a possible anti-NIMBYist tool and inclusionary zoning as a tool that could help us create positive gentrification. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that question a bit more. Positive versus negative gentrification, what did you mean exactly?
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, I'll come under some criticism, but gentrification in and by itself can be regarded as a positive process. I mean, it is a process by which investment returns to an area that has, for a set period of time, lost that investment. The problem being is that obviously when the market becomes involved, there's this creation of a marginalizing effect for those people who live in that community who can no longer afford the increase in rental values and the increase in property values that occur due to gentrification. So in terms to make gentrification a positive process, the key is to obviously balance those negative impacts. So inclusionary zoning allows you to somewhat take the market out of the equation because you are ensuring that affordability is tagged to the new growth. So, any new development in an area that is currently being gentrified would have that component where it would have to implement affordable units and therefore help mitigate and in some cases prevent the negative consequences of that process.
Councillor?
Thanks very much. I have no further questions. I just wanted to close by saying that I'm reminded in some ways of the discussion we had last summer in the context of AFA re the possibility of asking for land transfer taxation power, in that Councillor Collins' argument to me is a very important and good one. What if we do a very robust, tailored inclusionary zoning rule rule in Hamilton and adjoining municipalities or municipalities close by Southwest Ontario municipalities of note do not? And are we putting ourselves at a significant disadvantage? So I think that's just something to keep in mind and worry about in an appropriate way. That said, as in the conversation about land transfer taxation, I think it would be short-sighted to not go down the road of inclusionary zoning. Based on everything I'm hearing, it jives well with our LRT project that by all signs is coming. It jives well with our waterfront, notwithstanding and including all the complexities we've heard about in terms of how it might be implemented at the waterfront. It jives in terms of growth in the city and the hot real estate market in the city. And we know that we have a deep need. One of our most pressing, urgent crises in Hamilton is our social housing crisis. So I'm very hopeful for inclusionary zoning. And I'm grateful to the staff for helping us guide the way and find the way through all these complexities. I'm hopeful we can find our way to a good place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. And I have Councillor Van Der Beek.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Edward. Through you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Edward. Great presentation, as always. I have a couple of questions. I think, first of all, I'd like to clarify something. So this inclusionary zoning is looking like it's going to be more about additional rental housing in the city as opposed to affordable home ownership. Is that correct?
Through the chair to the councillor, no, that's not correct. That's an option that will have to be determined as you go through establishing the programmable elements of inclusionary zoning. Once again, if you look at those inclusionary frameworks that are in place, in fact, most of them focus more on affordable home ownership than they do on rental. But that's not to say that inclusionary zoning cannot obviously look towards the rental market.
So thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. So I think my confusion is around the discussion about another entity who's going to be in charge of the pricing of these units, etc. And so I guess that's where my confusion comes. So if this entity is going to be in charge of how much the units are going to continue to go for in the future, are they just going to be in charge of the person who owns it? Like I can't quite figure out where that would go. So if you can help me clarify that one, I'd appreciate that.
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, once again, these are all decisions to be made. A big element of what the ministry is telling us is the administration of these units. So it may not be a separate entity, which is the service provider that we typically have in how we regulate, social housing. This could be a component of City Hall, which makes sure that when those units are vacated or sold, that they're sold back to that, I'll call it an entity, but that portion of City Hall that regulates and determines who's next on the list for the affordability. The key is to maintain the affordability of the unit and understanding that the market's changing over time, and therefore that cost will have to be tagged to the growth of the economy.
Councillor?
Thank you. Sounds very complicated to me. It sounds like a lot of, I would call it government interference, but in a good way. But it just seems like another layer of government control that we have to be responsible for. However, I guess we'll see how that comes out when they bring things forward. So if we're gearing to affordability, we have things in place that have come from the government. For instance, the Housing and Affordability Act, I think it was called, in 2011, that said that cities had to put into their zoning bylaw the ability for second units in single-family semis, townhouses, and ancillary buildings like laneway garages. So where are we with that? Like, what's happened with that? Have we instituted that? Can pretty much anybody apply to put a second unit in their home to make home ownership affordable?
Through the chair to the councillor, you're talking to the right person. So currently we do have ability in our zoning bylaw to accommodate in certain areas secondary units. I think at the current point in time, the difficulty we have is if those secondary units are in or within an accessory building. We do have a policy in our Urban Hamilton official plan that says that, for that type of approach, we need to do a study just to ensure we understand fully the impacts. And the reason why I said to talk to the right person is because it's actually on my work plan to look at exactly that study and to see the components of that study to assist with that complete adoption of the secondary unit approach.
Councillor?
Thank you. I guess what I really want to ask is as we go forward, through you, Madam Chair, sorry, to Edward, as we go forward with whatever comes down from the province, are we actually taking advantage of the tools that we have already and the tools that we may be given to be addressing affordable housing in this city? So recognizing that affordable housing and social housing are not one and the same, and that we have in this, for this council and in this term of office, we have made poverty, affordable housing and social housing resolutions a priority. And so I guess my question is that as we're doing this and looking at certain aspects of inclusionary zoning, for instance, have we already got on that work plan as part of a bigger picture the opportunities that are there that we have not been fully utilizing, including changes to things like our bylaws, our parking enforcement bylaws, and our parking requirements, off-site parking requirements, and things like that will encourage people young and old, so young people who are looking for a first-time home who can't afford to purchase in some areas of the city, an opportunity to subsidize their purchase, their mortgage payment, or people who are now empty nesters and are looking to hang on to their home because now they're retired and their income is different, to keep making home ownership affordable and leaving rental accommodation for people who require rental accommodation.
Edward?
Through the chair to the council, that's a great question. I mean, I think as part of my process, thematically, I was trying to explore that concept itself, that this is a comprehensive strategy when you're dealing with housing. It's not going to be one policy or one solution that's going to really deal with the rising issue that we have when it comes to affordability for the entire spectrum. And I believe that there is a greater need to obviously integrate as best as possible that all the varying options that you do have. It's a complicated strategy. There are a number of moving parts, number of funding sources, number of programs, and it's very difficult to navigate those waters. Certainly, there's a great array of options available today, and quite frankly, inclusionary zoning may complement or may not be necessary depending on the specific requirements of Hamilton and how they deal with their strategy. So that's still on the table. I'm not at all suggesting that inclusionary zoning is somehow the silver bullet which will come forward and resolve those problems. I think we're doing some great work both within the city and through our community partners on dealing with this rising issue. And as I mentioned before, the biggest thing about inclusionary zoning for me in terms of success is making sure that people really continue to focus on this issue. It may not be inclusionary zoning is the answer, but it's people really struggling and working collaboratively to come up with a solution.
Councillor?
Thank you, and through you, so just one last thing. And so would you say then that in looking at it as a complete strategy, that we may answer the concerns of previous speakers about what happens with the suburbs and inclusionary zoning, and what happens with where the suburbs are full of single-family and semis and townhouses, and perhaps not so much high-rise apartment buildings, where there'd be the opportunity for that sort of fallout to meet the needs in the suburbs of more inclusionary, affordable housing.
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, if I understand your question correctly, there certainly is applicability for all areas of the city when it comes to affordability. It's just complicated based on the very varied geography in terms of coming up with a responsive and reasonable framework when it deals with inclusionary zoning. Back to your former point, there are lots of options that we still need to explore and implement when we come to creating a comprehensive strategy. I think there's many people working very hard on doing just that. And once again, this inclusionary zoning can be a tool potentially used or not to continue to address that issue.
Councillor?
Thank you, Edward.
Thank you. Councillor Conley?
Thank you. Very informative. I'm really glad that you came presented to us today, Edward. I'm just trying to get some clarity. Inclusionary zoning is something that the provincial government is working on, trying to get a policy for, and is there a time limit? Is any idea when that's going to come to?
Through the chair to the councillor, certainly inclusionary zoning has been around for a long time in other areas of the world, and I think Ontario have been asking of the province the ability to implement inclusionary zoning. There is a legislative requirement that the ministry must give to municipalities to be allowed to do inclusionary zoning. And in terms of timing, like I said, on speaking with members from the ministry, they're within this period of consultation. They understand the gravity and the complexity of this process, and so they're really at that point just gathering information from the development industry, from social housing providers, and from communities and municipalities. So in the next few months, we're hoping that the picture will come somewhat more into focus. Right now, we've been given very little information to go on.
And do you think when it comes through, is it going to be mandatory that we do inclusionary zoning, or is it going to be optional per each community?
Through the chair to the councillor, that is in fact one of the areas where they have provided guidance, and they have mentioned on a number of times that it will be an enabling framework. So what we've determined is that the municipalities will be able to elect whether they accommodate inclusionary zoning or not. It will be up to the municipalities.
And even if we do it, it's not going to solve any the problem. It's going to assist as one of the pieces that will assist people trying to get affordable housing, etc. Is that fair to say?
Edward?
Through the chair to the council, I think there's a certain need to manage expectations. For a long time, inclusionary zoning has been discussed as a means to significantly address housing waitlists and so forth. And my presentation was hopefully a cautionary tale that while there are some great success stories with inclusionary zoning, there is no silver bullet to the housing crisis that we have.
So when you talk about inclusionary zoning, chair, would that include developments like building 300 houses in a survey or something? Would inclusionary zoning be part of that, or is it more for apartment building complexes, etc.? What is the plan? Because when you talk about suburbs, I guess, we don't have high-rise apartments. I don't anyway. Might be getting some shortly, but don't have any right now. 19-story one, but anyways, does it include if I'm building 300 townhouses in a survey? Could that be part of inclusionary zoning? That we could take some of those houses and use them for affordable housing?
Eddie, or Edward, sorry.
Through the chair to the councillor, it could well be. Once again, we are a creature of the province, and we are looking to them to see what type of guidelines they provide us. If they really just give us the ball and say run with it, we will have to make that decision as a municipality how we deal with the different geographies that we have between the rural, suburban, and urban areas, and that may include, whether we extend the program to include all areas or reserve it for certain areas of the city.
So when we make those decisions, it won't be on an ad hoc situation where you might do it at Stony Creek but not in Ancaster, Dundas or whatever one you want to, it would be for all of Hamilton suburbs. Would that be the idea?
Through the chair, that certainly would be my recommendation. I mean, to indiscriminately choose different sections of the city could be very problematic in terms of the programming of this inclusionary zoning framework, just because similar to the concern with competition between different municipalities, you may have competitions within the city which may not be desirable from a city building perspective.
Councillor?
Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you. Second time, Councillor Scully.
Thank you. Edward, do you know if we have more demand for affordable housing or social housing?
Through the chair to the councillor, that's another great question, and part of my presentation was the need to really evaluate where in the spectrum we have the greatest demand, and not necessarily that inclusionary zoning should deal with the greatest demand, but just to understand the context of demand. Certainly, as I mentioned, there's this concept of urban filtering, so if you can somehow target a certain area, is there a possibility for that to benefit indirectly other portions of the spectrum? You know, it's those types of concepts that really need to be investigated for Hamilton, but we need to understand that context, and you're right, exactly where the affordable and affordability issues are.
Thank you. Councillor?
Through the chair, how much more affordable is affordable housing? What is the percentage of a discount?
Just to clarify through the councillor, based on the provincial definition, a dwelling unit that sells for under $300,000 would meet the test of affordable in the city of Hamilton based on the provincial definition. So when we're talking about affordable, that is the price threshold. So that would be whether it's a townhouse, apartment building, a single-family dwelling, back-to-back unit, provided it sells for less than $300,000, it would be considered to be affordable, owner-occupied affordable in the city of Hamilton.
And rent?
The test is sort of correlates to 30% of the household income being spent on rent, so, or whether it be on principal mortgage payment or on rent. So again, it would probably be, I think it's in that $1,200 to $1,500 range. I would just have to confirm with our housing staff, but that would meet the threshold for affordability based, it's not based on what rental households are actually paying, but it's defined as 30% of the average household income within the city of Hamilton, and that's how the province sets the definition. So that's why I think it's about that $1,200 to $1,500 a month would be considered to be a maximum affordable rent within the city of Hamilton.
For, through the chair, for a one-bedroom, two-bedroom, three-bedroom house?
It's based on household income, so it's irrespective of whether it's they're renting a one-bedroom apartment or if that household needs a three-bedroom apartment. If the unit is being delivered under that sort of price range, it meets the provincial definition of affordable. So for those councillors who remember the 90s, all the townhouse projects that were being approved, they were meeting the test of affordability because they were owner-occupied affordable, and then those units were then, the province was sort of piggybacking on those sort of private sector affordable housing projects, being directly involved in the provision of affordable housing, where the province was working with nonprofit groups or co-ops to deliver affordable housing that would then be means tested against the tenants or the residents of those individual units.
Councillor?
Through the chair, how do we determine who is eligible for affordable housing? My concern is that you can't actually refuse anyone because of human rights. Is that true?
Have we got someone here from...
So the part of the issue becomes, through you, Madam Chairman, is the means testing as well, so that as they may meet the initial definition based on their income, so they provide they demonstrate their income sources as to what they are, sort of their income salary is, they would then meet that threshold. But once they're in there, if their income increases, there is no ongoing means in some of these units to do that ongoing testing and the means testing to ensure that those units stay affordable. And I think as Mr. Edward indicated at the early discussions with the province, or Mr. John, we indicated that was an issue raised with the province as to how do you ensure the long-term affordability of these units, whether it's because of the owner or the tenants, their income increases, and or sort of the resale or the re-rental controls if they're within the public realm, to ensure that they provide that long-term affordability, as opposed to when the units are being within either the city or a non-profit groups, which is responsible for ensuring the long-term affordability of those units.
Councillor?
Through the chair, if the city does move forward to include affordable housing at the waterfront, that will be some of the most sought-after real estate and rental units in the city of Hamilton. How can we ensure that people who are applying, and can we actually prevent people who have is there any way of actually determining who can go and access those units for, 20, 30% less than the going rate? Again, from my understanding is that you can't prevent anyone from from renting those units. And I'll go back to the example of Olivia Chow and Jack Layton using affordable housing units. How do you prevent anybody in the prime piece of real estate in the city of Hamilton renting that clearly don't fall or aren't in need of social or affordable housing?
Excuse me, I think we're talking about process of affordable housing rather than the planning of affordable housing. So I will go to Joanna to see if she has an answer for that. But I think it's probably best to wait until Joanne Prowl or someone from Community Social Services can actually talk about the process of applications, who's eligible and who's not. So Joanna, I know that you probably you probably didn't catch the entire question. The entire question was based on how do we determine who's available for social housing and who is not. If you're not able to answer that, Kristen. Sorry, Joanna, thank you.
Am I on? There we are. It's quite administratively complex, but we can certainly test incomes of people who are renting those units and test them on an ongoing basis to ensure that they're paying what they can afford rather than something more.
Why don't you reword it, but keep in mind that we need to have the people who are actually doing the process in the room. That might make it beneficial for your answers.
I'll try to reword it. My question is, how do you assure the people who would have access to the units, the number of affordable units is there a limit in terms of their income to prevent or to restrict certain people having access to affordable units?
Through the chair to the councillor, I can maybe come partway into answering that. So as you go through, and this is purely on inclusionary zoning, so I'm speaking on if the city were to implement inclusionary zoning and the program elements, through that framework they would come up, as the slide shows, and have to determine the target income groups that would be eligible. So they would determine from study and from discussions with the ministry what that threshold of that target income would be that would make them eligible. And then obviously we would have to monitor that to make sure that over time they don't increase in terms of their income and then become uneligible. So there is an ongoing administrative process. To your point on the human rights aspect of whether we can or not do that, I'm of the opinion that the ministry will come in and provide clarification as they make the legislative requirements through the inclusionary zoning process.
Okay, thank you. So just to be clear, let's keep it on the planning perspective because we have planning staff here, just so that you can get the correct answers. Are you finished? Okay, Councillor Farr for the second time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just on some of the stuff that I've heard, I guess one of the ways we can ensure affordable housing maintains its integrity in terms of who's in those units is if the City Housing Hamilton folks managed it. However, we're not in expansion mode right now. Our president will tell you. We're just trying to keep up with maintaining. And to that end, and specific to the setting sail secondary plan area, it's something you know very well, Edward, and one of the many points with respect to the vision, and which has been alluded to by a previous speaker from Ward 1 and well presented, is that we may include in the vision, we may include 25% affordable housing in the setting sail secondary plan. Through you, Chair. True.
Through the chair to the councillor, there is a policy in the setting sail secondary plan that speaks to just that, yes.
Back to the point through you, Chair, thank you, that I made the first time around, where we began a community conversation about a year ago, monthly community conversations on the West Harbour area. with respect to a commitment to a net gain of affordable housing in the setting sail secondary plan area, and of 100 to 200 units. And one of the things I didn't mention before, but it's certainly well known, is we're including our partnerships with the private sector in making that net gain possible. And certainly quite publicly, I would assume, well, one of the two quite publicly, but the other is well known, it seems, in the North End, private folks are going after that net gain pledge. They're from separate orgs, not affiliated to the city, however, are both steadfastly being very diligent in accomplishing many units. I'd say upwards 50 to 60 units of the 100 to 200 that we're pledging be part of a net gain. They are not, through you, Chair, long-winded preamble, but through you, that work wouldn't, our inclusionary zoning work wouldn't help in those cases where they're actually building nothing but affordable housing.
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, they would obviously already meet the requirement if ever a requirement was placed upon new development, presumably if it's 100% affordable. I mean, I think we certainly could still discuss cost offsets as an option, because that will be part of the package if it is ever introduced, as to what additional planning gain these types of developments can endure, and that may be part of the discussion too.
Thank you,
So
Councillor.
either we've already had this conversation, or you
Okay.
could read my mind, but certainly on the screen and at the bottom bullet, particularly the streamlined approval process, both orgs are in the ward, both are giddy to get going, and both will tell you this is all great. They love it. Inclusionary zoning talk, affordable housing talk, the build up. A lot of the organizations are right here in Ward 2 to begin with, so it's no surprise, and gentrification is definitely a main topic of conversation, and not only in Ward 2, obviously throughout the lower city, throughout the city. So a lot of people are very impressed that we've had a special planning meeting on this subject today, and all of the work that you and Jason and Ed and everybody on staff have done. But they would love for us, sooner rather than later, to at least take that streamlined approval process bullet out of this great conversation that is relatable and do it soon. So how can we, what can we do to that end to streamline approvals for those who are giddy to get going on creating nothing but affordable housing? And in this case, one is about 40 units of housing with support. So that's when we're talking about the spectrum, that's over here. From affordable home ownership over here, and the other is keeping seniors aging in place. Through you, Chair.
Edward?
Through the chair to the councillor, when it becomes the streamlined approvals process, obviously there are some legislative requirements that must be met. Outside of that, there really just has to be a focus on reviewing the application in short order. I think the City of Hamilton has had some success with some notable projects in certainly getting them before Planning Committee and Council within an expedited time frame. So certainly the effort is there and the focus is there, provided we meet those legislative frameworks.
Thank you, Councillor.
So you mentioned the Tivoli and you mentioned the Connolly, and I appreciate that, through you, Chair. And finally, these ones undoubtedly would, as soon as that expedited approvals process occurred, already they're ready to go and start putting a shovel in the ground, as opposed to your two examples. I'm not knocking it. I was very impressed and remain impressed today that the Tivoli and the Connolly approvals went, within 112 days from concept to approval. But they would like that too. So is this something maybe perhaps offline, and it is somewhat relatable, not completely, but maybe flowing from the inclusionary or affordable housing conversations that we have in a special planning meeting, we can maybe create some streamlined approvals process for those interested in going sooner rather than later on these kinds of projects that are key for not only the downtown but the entire city?
Edward?
Yeah, so through the chair, I think a lot of those questions are starting to get into sort of the realm of what we're looking at through the Open for Business initiative, which is looking at streamlined approvals across the board, looking at applying lean process improvements to approvals. Specific to affordable housing, I think the creation of Ed's position actually was one aspect of actually putting some dedicated resources, some expertise specifically on the housing file to provide some extra attention when those projects come through the door. But in terms of, and we also have a report coming to the next planning cycle related to planning fees for affordable housing that also responds to some council direction we've had. So we are looking generally at approvals process through open for business, and then in terms of fees and providing some targeted resources within the department to support affordable housing, we're looking at those issues as well.
Thank you, Councillor.
And when, sorry, just about, when will we, Jason, have a report back on the feasibility of all what you've just...
The timeline, Mr. Thorne?
So through the chair, on the planning fees for affordable housing is the next committee meeting, which is May the 17th.
And the streamlined, I have to go to an open for business meeting to see about streamlined processes for 100% affordable housing builds.
Okay, Mr. Thorne.
So through the chair, so we just did at the last Open for Business Subcommittee an update on sort of the last year in terms of some of the initiatives and process improvements that were made. Again, these are applying to all applications, not just to affordable housing. If there are specific directions or requests related to some of the approvals process as they apply to affordable housing projects, I would certainly be interested in hearing those. The same Planning Act approval and timeline issues would apply, though. So it would be a question of whether or not our focus has been looking at all aspects of development and all forms of development through Open for Business to this point.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you. And seeing no other questions, may I please have a motion to receive presentation? Councillor Collins, Councillor Conley, all those in favor? Thank you. Before we adjourn, I think it's important to thank Ida and Kristen for all this work, and Alyssa and Mr. Thorne with your staff. Shonda Wang and John McKenzie, Joanna Weiss, and Edward John. Thank you very much for the workshop, very informative, and it's something for us to all take back and digest. So may I have now a motion to adjourn? Councillor Pearson, Councillor Vanderbeek, all those in favor? All those in favor? Thank you.